They found the camels first, standing perfectly upright, preserved by the salt and the suffocating heat of the Taklamakan Desert, a caravan of 40 beasts. Their packs were still heavy with the finest silks of the Tang Dynasty. Gold coins from distant empires spilled into the sand, but there were no footprints, no struggle. And as the explorers opened the mouths of the fallen merchants, they found the ultimate betrayal of human nature. Every single tongue had been surgically removed, not by a blade, but by something that left the tissue cauterized and silvered. This was not a raid. It was a mass silencing. A forbidden ritual carried out in the heart of the Silk Road to ensure that a secret stayed buried beneath the dunes forever. History tells us this city was lost to a sandstorm. That is a lie. The desert did not swallow the city of silence. The city chose to disappear after witnessing a truth so corrosive it threatened to unmake the world. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. Imagine the flickering of a single candle against the cold stone walls of an archive that time forgot. We are moving away from the noise of the modern world, entering a space where the wind only whispers of what used to be. Listen closely to the rhythm of the desert heart. The year was 1902. Sven Hedin, the famed Swedish explorer, stood on the edge of the singing sands. He was a man who believed in maps and logic. Yet, as he ventured deeper into the Taklamakan, which locals called the place of no return, the logic began to dissolve. The desert is not just a landscape of sand. It is a psychological weight. It is a sea that remembers. Hedin noted in his private journals, which were later suppressed by the Royal Geographical Society, that the compasses began to spin without cause. The air grew cold even under the midday sun. He was searching for the ruins of Lulan, but he found something that was never meant to be found. A city that sat in the center of the trade routes like a spider in a web. A city that had been intentionally erased from the official silk maps of the 8th century. Why would an empire delete its most profitable hub? The city of Nia was once a jewel. It was the place where East met West, where ideas and gold flowed like water. But as the silk trade reached its peak, a darkness began to seep into the ledgers. It started with a merchant named Xuanzang, though not the monk of legend, but a trader of shadows. He had brought a casket from the high mountains of the Hindu Kush, a casket that remained, closed even as he sold the treasures inside. Those who spent time in his company began to change. They grew quiet. They stopped haggling. They started to look at the horizon with a vacant, hollow gaze, historical anchor. In 1901, Sir Arl Stein discovered the Nia site, finding hundreds of wooden tablets written in the Korosti script. While these tablets spoke of everyday administration, nearly 40% of the excavated records from the lower strata remained undecipherable, featuring a geometric syntax that appeared more like a mathematical code than a human language. This code was the first sign of the psychological decay that was spreading through the city walls. The people of the desert began to build differently. They constructed towers with no windows. They built wells that tapped into the deep, ancient aquifers, but they did not drink the water. They used it to wash the stones of the city square every night at midnight. Imagine the sound of thousands of hands scrubbing stone in total silence. No one spoke. No children cried. The city was functioning. Trade was happening, But the soul of the place had been replaced by a rhythmic, mechanical devotion to a secret. What was the merchant Wanzang hiding in that silvered casket? And why did the governors of the neighboring regions suddenly stop sending tax collectors to the city gates? The records show a sudden drop in communication in the year 742. No letters. No warnings. Just a profound, heavy silence that drifted over the dunes like a physical fog. The desert did not just bury the city. It preserved a terror that had become domestic. The windowless towers of Nia were not built for defense against an external enemy. They were built for isolation. Each home had become a private vault, and within those vaults, the citizens of the Silk Road were guarding a secret that had begun to rot their own history. As the Swedish and British expeditions moved through the ruins, they noticed a strange architectural choice. The doors were high, narrow, and reinforced with iron from the Altai Mountains. Yet there were no windows to let in the light of the stars. It was as if the inhabitants were terrified of what might look in from the night sky, or perhaps they were afraid of what their own eyes might reflect back to the world, the Council of Merchants. The true rulers of this silent hub had established a code that was found etched into the foundations of the Great Hall. It was not a code of trade or taxes. It was a code of sensory deprivation. The law stated that after the third bell of the evening, no sound was to be produced within the city walls. No music, no conversation. Even the animals were kept in underground pens lined with thick felt to dampen their cries. The city was a living ghost, a machine of silence that hummed with an unnatural energy. Who was the witness? And why did the most powerful merchants of the Silk Road bow to a figure who lived in the shadow of a windowless tower? The answer lay in the silvered casket that Xuanzang had brought from the mountains. It was said that the casket contained a mirror made of a material that was not glass or metal. It was a surface that did not reflect the physical body, but the intentions of the soul. In the calm, cool air of the desert night, the elite of Nia would gather in the central square to gaze into the void. They believed that by surrendering their voices, they were gaining a sight that spanned across time. But the cost of this sight was the slow, surgical erasure of their humanity. The caravan that was found decades later, with 40 camels and 40 silent men, was the city's last attempt to spread this gift to the rest of the world. They were the ambassadors of the silence. But the desert, in its vast and ancient wisdom, seemed to know that some truths are too heavy for the world of men to carry. The Taklamakan rose up in a fury of sand and wind, not to kill the merchants, but to quarantine them. The cauterized tongues were not an act of violence from an outside tribe. They were a self-inflicted sacrifice, a final seal placed upon their mouths to ensure that if they were ever found, they could never betray the nature of what they had seen in the heart of the windowless city. Imagine the sound of the wind as it scours the wood of those ancient buildings. It is a dry, rhythmic sound, like the breathing of a creature that has been asleep for 1,000 years. As you listen, you can almost feel the weight of the sand pressing against the walls, holding back the secrets of the Tang merchants. The silence of the desert is not empty. It is full of the echoes of those who chose to stop speaking. Every grain of sand is a witness to a bargain that was made in the dark. Beneath a sky that was too bright to bear, the explorers who returned from Nia often suffered from a peculiar form of psychological distress. They would return to the cities of Europe and Asia and find themselves unable to bear the sound of voices. They would retreat into quiet libraries or isolated country estates, staring at the walls as if waiting for a message to appear in the dust. They had touched the edge of the city of silence, and the silence had followed them home. It was as if the city was not a place in the sand, but a state of mind that was slowly reclaiming the world. One listener at a time, the merchants knew that the silk and gold were temporary. They understood that the only thing that truly lasts is the truth that is never told. As the candle flickers and the room grows darker, consider the possibility that the city of silence is still there, just beneath the surface, waiting for the wind to shift, waiting for someone to stumble upon the silvered mirror and look deep into the void, the psychological shadow cast by the city of silence did not dissipate when the sands reclaimed the walls. For the explorers of the early 20th century, the discovery of Neo was not a triumph of archaeology, but a descent into a specific kind of madness. Sven Hedden's private notes describe a sensation of being watched by the very air itself. He wrote of the heavy light of the desert, a luminosity that seemed to reveal things that were not physically there. In the center of the ruins, beneath the shifting dunes of the central square, his team uncovered a structure that sat like a dark heart in the geometric grid. It was a well, but its depth was unfathomable. When they lowered lanterns into the abyss, the light did not reflect off water. It was swallowed by a matte, black substance that seemed to absorb all sound and heat. This was the location of the legendary idol of the well, according to local Uyghur oral traditions, which were recorded and then promptly classified by the colonial authorities. The idol was not a statue of a god or a king. It was a pillar of the same silvered material found in Xuanzang's casket. The elders whispered that the idol was a tuning fork for the silence. As long as the citizens remained quiet, the pillar would hum with a frequency that granted them visions of the stars and the hidden mathematics of the earth. But if the silence was broken, the frequency would turn into a weapon of psychological disintegration. The Tang Dynasty was an empire of information. They understood that a secret is a living thing. If you kill a man, his secret might survive in his children or his students. But if you send the man to the city of silence, his secret becomes part of the desert. The emperor's records from the year 751 mention a great cleansing of the silk maps. Hundreds of miles of trade routes were redirected. Guides were executed. Any map found containing the coordinates of Nia was burned, and the owners were branded as traitors. It was a systematic, imperial-level erasure of an entire geography. They were not just hiding a city. They were hiding a fracture in the human mind that the city represented as the sun sets over the dunes of your own consciousness. Consider the photographs taken by the 1902 expedition. In the official archives, these photos show empty streets and weathered wood. But there is a second set of plates rumored to be held in a private vault in Stockholm. These plates, taken with long exposures in the dead of the desert night, show something different. They show blurred, elongated figures standing in the windowless towers. Figures that do not have faces, but surfaces that catch the moonlight. The explorers claimed these were tricks of the light, mere optical illusions caused by the heat and the dust, but they never explained why every man who stood in the city square that night lost his ability to dream. In color for the rest of his life, the psychological weight of the silk road is built on these gaps in the record. The things that were traded in the dark were far more valuable than silk or spices. They were trading the ability to forget. They were trading the heavy burden of the past for the cold, clean vacuum of the silence. The city was a temple to the act of letting go. But as the merchants found out, once you let go of everything, there is nothing left to hold you to the earth. You become like the camels found in the sand, perfectly preserved, perfectly upright, but entirely empty. Listen to the rhythm of the wind. It is the sound of the city breathing through the sand. It is a slow, steady pulse that invites you to join the merchants in their windowless rooms. The desert does not want your gold. It does not want your history. It only wants your voice. It wants you to surrender the noise of your thoughts to the vast, cool geometry of the dunes. The modern world has not forgotten the city of Nia, even if it tries to ignore the heavy implications of its existence. In 2015, a team of geophysicists using advanced deep-ground penetrating radar made a discovery that sent a tremor through the academic world. Beneath the shifting dunes of the Taklamakan, they found that the city was far larger than the surface ruins ever suggested. There exists a second subterranean level, a mirrored city of stone and silver that sits exactly 100 feet below the desert floor. The radar images show a series of chambers that are perfectly preserved, with no signs of collapse or decay despite the weight of 12 centuries of sand. Yet, despite the immense historical value of such a find, the permits for excavation remain perpetually under review by the authorities. It is as if the modern world has inherited the ancient fear of the Tang emperors, a fear that some things, once buried, should never be brought back into the light of conversation. This rhythmic pulse is the final legacy of the City of Silence. It is a reminder that the merchants did not just disappear. They transformed. They became part of the landscape, a psychological layer of the Silk Road that still influences those who travel the desert paths today. Local guides speak of the whispering sands, where the dunes produce a sound like thousands of voices speaking at once, but with no words. They say that if you stay in the desert too long, your own thoughts begin to lose their sound. You start to think in images. You start to think in the cold, clear geometry of the stars. The Council of Merchants knew that the ultimate power is not gold or silk. It is the ability to control the narrative of history by removing oneself from it. By choosing silence, they became immortal. They became a myth that cannot be debunked because there are no records left to challenge. They are the masters of the open loop, a story that never truly ends because the final chapter was never written. The desert is a keeper of silences. And perhaps the greatest secret it guards is not a city of stone, but the knowledge of how to quiet a human soul. As you drift closer to the edge of your own sleep, remember the windowless towers and the silvered mirrors. The silence is not an end. It is a beginning. A space where the noise of the world falls away, leaving only the cool, dark truth of the desert night. The merchants of the Silk Road are still there, standing upright in the sand, waiting for the wind to shift one last time. But the truth they carry is a weight that few are ready to bear. The shadows in your room are long now, stretching like the ruins of a city that once ruled the world. The candle of history is burning low, and the ink on the maps is fading into the dark. But the mystery of the city does not die with the light. It only changes its shape. For beneath the silence of the dunes, there is always another layer. Another chamber, another secret waiting for a voice that is brave enough to remain quiet. The architecture of the desert was never meant to be understood by the living. In the center of the Taklamakan, the ruins of the City of Silence reveal a terrifying structural anomaly that defies every rule of ancient military defense. The Great Walls of Nia were not built with battlements facing outward. There were no platforms for archers to repel invaders. Instead, the masonry was polished to a glass-like finish on the interior, curved inward to prevent anything from climbing out. The gates were reinforced with iron bars that slid only from the exterior, effectively turning a prosperous trade hub into a massive geometric cage. For centuries, we believed these were the remnants of a fortress. We were wrong. This was a containment vessel for a psychological contagion that the Tang Dynasty feared more than any invading army. Every street, every corridor, and every windowless tower was designed according to a mathematical sequence intended to fracture the human sense of direction, trapping the inhabitants in a loop of eternal silence. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. Imagine the flickering of a single candle against the cold stone walls of an archive that time forgot. We are moving away from the noise of the modern world, entering a space where the wind only whispers of what used to be. Listen closely to the rhythm of the desert heart. To understand the geometry of the ghost city, one must first understand the fear of the Silk Road merchants. They did not fear the thieves of the dunes or the heat of the sun. They feared the geometry of the void. As the explorers of the early 20th century moved through the abandoned streets, they found that the city of Nia was laid out in a perfect golden ratio, but it was a ratio that led nowhere. The streets did not converge at a market or a palace. They spiraled inward, tighter and tighter, toward the central well that we spoke of before. It was a labyrinth designed to exhaust the mind, a physical representation of the silence that had taken hold of the people. The walls were built of sundried mud brick, mixed with a salt-heavy mortar that had turned the structures into something resembling bone. They stood 30 feet high, towering over the narrow alleys where no two people could walk abreast. There were no balconies, no decorative carvings, only the flat, repetitive surface of the clay. Architects who have studied the site in recent years noted that the alignment of the buildings creates a permanent acoustic shadow. Even when the desert winds howl at 100 miles per hour, the streets of Nia remain perfectly, unnervingly still. The geometry was a trap for sound. This was the architecture of the witness. The people of Nia did not live in these homes. They were preserved within them. Each building was a cell in a massive, city-wide monastery of the unspoken. The geometry served a dual purpose. While it kept the inhabitants contained, it also served as a lens for the stars. On certain nights of the lunar cycle, the alignment of the towers would channel the moonlight into the central square with such intensity that the silvered surfaces of the city would begin to glow with a cold, blue fire. This was the moment of the great alignment, when the silence was at its peak and the veil between the desert and the deep earth was at its thinnest. Why would an empire invest so much gold and labor into building a city that was a prison? The Tang record suggests that the contagion of the void was a psychological state that could be caught through the eyes. If a person saw the truth contained within the silvered casket, they could never be allowed to return to the world of men. Their very presence would begin to pull the reality of others apart. Thus, the geometry of the ghost city was a mercy. It was a way to keep the secret from leaking out into the trade routes. The walls were the final boundary between the history we know and the silence we cannot bear to understand. As you wander deeper into these skeletal remains of an empire's obsession, the physical weight of the silence begins to press against your chest. The geometry of the ghost city was designed to be a living meditation, a forced detachment from the rhythms of the natural world. Every angle of the masonry was calculated to disrupt the flow of the wind, turning the air itself into a heavy, stagnant blanket. In the narrow alleys, the shadows do not behave as they should. They stretch and twist in directions that defy the position of the sun, as if the very geometry of the buildings is bending the light into a shape that the human eye was never meant to perceive. The salt-heavy mortar used in the construction was not a choice of convenience. It was a choice of preservation. Salt has long been associated with the sealing of spirits and the purification of space. By mixing the clay of the desert with the minerals of the Dead Sea, the architects created a city that would never rot, but would also never feel alive. The walls hum with a faint crystalline resonance when the temperature drops at night. It is a sound that occupies the space between hearing and feeling, a vibration that works its way into the bone and settles. They're like a cold fever dot. Why would an empire waste the wealth of a kingdom on the mortar of a prison? The use of lapis lazuli suggests that the walls were not just meant to be strong. They were meant to be holy, or perhaps cursed. The deep blue dust was believed to act as a barrier for the soul, preventing the contagion of the void from seeping through the porous clay and into the surrounding desert. The city was a sarcophagus for a living secret, and the geometry was the lid that kept it sealed. The inhabitants of Nia lived in a state of perpetual disorientation. The labyrinthine floor plans mentioned earlier were not just in the residential complexes. They were a citywide mandate. No path in Nia was straight. Every journey from one room to another involved a series of rhythmic turns that mimicked the movement of the stars. It was a psychological grinding stone, designed to wear down the individual identity until only the silence remained. The people were not just silent. They were empty. As the candle flickers and the darkness of your room deepens, consider the sensation of walking through these narrow alleys. The walls curve inward, ever so slightly, creating a sense of being perpetually watched by the stones themselves. There are no corners for the eye to rest upon, only the continuous, swirling line of the spiral. It is a geometry that demands your total attention, yet offers no destination. It is the architecture of the infinite, trapped within a few square miles of the Taklamakan. The merchants of the silk road would pass by Nia and see only a fortress of silence. They did not know that behind those inward-facing walls, a civilization was participating in a grand experiment of the mind. They were attempting to build a gateway to the absolute using geometry as their key. But as the desert eventually proved, the absolute is a heavy guest. It does not live within walls. It consumes them. The experience of existing within the geometry of Nia was not merely a physical challenge, but a relentless psychological grinding. To walk these streets was to submit to a fractal logic that slowly dismantled the ego. Every turn was designed to feel identical to the last, creating a sense of recursive time where the beginning and the end of a journey were indistinguishable. This was the acoustic shadow in its most lethal form. Within these walls, your own heartbeat would eventually become the loudest sound you could perceive, a rhythmic drumming that synced with the faint, crystalline humming of the salt-infused clay. The architects understood that when a human being is deprived of external landmarks and familiar sounds, the mind begins to turn inward. Hunting for patterns in the silence, the internal layout of the dwellings was a mirror of this urban maze. As you moved from the narrow entrance into the inner sanctum, the ceiling would gradually lower while the walls would narrow, forcing a physical posture of submission. There was no room for expansive movement. The architecture demanded a slow, measured pace, a deliberate crawl toward the center of one's own isolation. It was a space designed for the containment of a singular thought. a vault for a mind that had been touched by the void and could no longer participate in the chaotic noise of the silk road. Why would a civilization dedicate its greatest engineering minds to straightening the very trees of the desert? The answer lies in the resonance. A crooked beam would disrupt the flow of the lunar vibrations that the city was built to capture. The straight lines acted as a conduit, a network of ivory-colored clay and wood that channeled the silence from the upper towers down into the subterranean chambers. It was a symphony of architectural stillness, a composition where every brick and every beam was a note in a song that was never meant to be. Heard by human ears, the Council of Merchants, who observed the city from the safety of the distant trade hubs, viewed Nia as a necessary sacrifice. They understood that the prosperity of the Silk Road depended on the stability of reality itself. If the contagion of the void were to spread, the very concept of value and trade would dissolve. Gold would lose its luster, and silk would become nothing more than dead fiber. To save the world of the living, they built a tomb for the witnesses. They turned geometry into a guardian, ensuring that those who had gazed into the silvered casket would remain anchored within the spiral, forever tracing the lines of a labyrinth that had no exit. As the air in your own room grows still, imagine the sensation of placing your hand against one of these salt-bone walls. It would feel cold, even in the desert heat, a temperature that belongs to the deep earth. You would feel the vibration of the sand as it scours the exterior, but the sound would be absent, replaced by a deep, resonant thrumming that seems to speak directly to the center of your brain. The geometry is not just around you. It is beginning to settle within you, mapping out a new geography of silence in the hidden corners of your mind. The final geometry of the ghost city was not horizontal, but vertical. As the Swedish and British explorers mapped the surface, they realized that the spiral streets were merely the gears of a much larger machine that extended into the deep earth. The central well of Nea was the axis of this machine, a shaft of polished basalt that bypassed the water table and reached into the bedrock of the Taklamakan. Modern seismic imaging from 2015 has revealed that the subterranean city is a mirror image of the surface, but with one critical difference. The walls of the lower city are not made of clay and salt, but of a fused silicate material that resembles obsidian. These lower chambers are not residential. They are resonators. They were built to vibrate in harmony with the rotation of the planet, creating a pocket of absolute stillness where time and sound behave according to a different set of laws. This amplification of the Earth's heartbeat was the ultimate goal of the city of silence. The Tang Dynasty did not just want to contain the witnesses. They wanted to use them as a bridge. They believed that a human mind, stripped of all external noise and anchored in a perfectly resonant geometry, could become a portal. The citizens of Nea were the living components of a planetary-scale communication device. They were the processors of the silence, translating the deep language of the earth and the stars into a form that the Empire could, perhaps, one day use. But the cost was the total erasure of the human element. The people became the architecture, and the architecture became the secret dot as you reach the final center of your own rest. Think of the silence not as an absence, but as a presence. The geometry of Nea is a reminder that some structures are built to outlast the memory of their purpose. The desert has covered the walls, and the wind has scoured the records, but the frequency remains. The silence is still there, vibrating in the salt and the clay, waiting for a listener who is quiet enough to hear it. The Council of Merchants and the Tang Emperors are long gone, But the city they built to keep the world's secrets is still functioning. It is a machine that runs on the surrender of the voice. The candle has flickered out. The maps have been rolled away and returned to the dark archives. The journey through the geometry of the ghost city ends here, in the stillness of the night. But remember, as you drift into the deep, windowless towers of your own sleep, that the walls are still there. The spiral is still turning, and the desert never truly forgets the names of those who chose to stay quiet. The silence is your guardian now. Let it carry you back into the heart of the dunes, where the wind only whispers of what the king buried. The secrets of the Silk Road are anchored in the sand. But to understand the true weight of Forbidden's knowledge, we must travel to the mountain peaks where the air is thin and the monks discovered a truth that turned their hair white in a single night. What did they find in the cave beyond the clouds? And why did the Empire send 1,000 soldiers to seal the entrance with molten lead? The silence of the desert is but a prelude to the scream of the mountains. The ledger was found in a false floor. Beneath the rotting rugs of a merchant's villa in the lower district of Nia, it was wrapped in the skin of a snow leopard, a hide so old it had turned to the texture of iron. This was the Forbidden's ledger of a trader named Malik al-Shirazi, a man whose name was erased from every tax record of the Tang Dynasty, while other merchants recorded weights of ginger, saffron, and silk. Malik recorded weights of human focus. He documented the exact moment when his fellow travelers stopped dreaming. He tracked the precise day when the color faded from their eyes, according to his final entry. The gold in the city's central well was not meant for trade. It was bait, a psychological tether to keep the merchants from realizing that the city had already drifted away from the physical world. Malik's last words were not a prayer. They were a confession. He admitted that the silk they were shipping to the west was not made of mulberry leaves, but of the very silence they had harvested from the windowless towers. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. Imagine the flickering of a single candle against the cold stone walls of an archive that time forgot. We are moving away from the noise of the modern world, entering a space where the wind only whispers of what used to be. Listen closely to the rhythm of the desert heart. To hold the ledger of Malik al-Shirazi is to touch the cold center of the Silk Road's darkest era. When Sir Arlstein first uncovered the leopard skin bundle in 1901, he did not realize he was holding a document that would haunt his sleep for the next 3 decades. The ledger was written in a mixture of Sogdian and a rhythmic, geometric script that seemed to shift under the flickering light of his camp lanterns. Malik was a man of high standing, a primary financier for the caravans that bridged the gap between Chang'an and the Mediterranean. But as the year 745 approached, his entries ceased to be about profit. They became a biological record of a city's transformation into a living tomb. He wrote of the silvering of the blood, a condition where the merchants began to move with a strange, liquid grace, their voices becoming a series of low-frequency hums that vibrated in the back of the throat. The ledger details the construction of the false floor in his villa, not to hide his gold, but to hide his own voice. Malik was the last man in Nia who still possessed the ability to speak. He spent his nights whispered into the leopard skin, recording the slow, methodical erasure of his neighbors. He watched through a crack in his door as the council of merchants held their silent meetings, their eyes fixed on a single black candle that produced no heat and cast no shadow, This guild was known in the shadows as the Keepers of the Thread. Malik was their primary accountant, but the thread they kept was not made of physical fiber. It was a conceptual line that connected the architecture of the city to the resonance of the deep earth. Malik's ledger reveals that the gold found in the central well was being used as a frequency resonator. Every night, the priests of the labyrinth would strike the basalt walls of the well with silver hammers. The sound was so pure it would cause the gold coins to dance and float in the air. This was not an act of magic. It was a high-level mastery of acoustic physics that the world has long since forgotten. The gold acted as a storage device for the collective silence of the people. Malik's ledger described the texture of the silk in a way that defied common sense. He noted that the fabric began to take on a weight that exceeded its physical volume. A single bolt of Nia silk, which should have been as light as a summer breeze, began to feel like a sheet of lead when carried in the silence of the night. This was the blood-stained silk mentioned in the Whispers of the Silk Road. It was not stained with physical blood, but with the vital essence of the weavers who had stopped speaking. Malik claimed that the red dye used in the fabric was infused with the powdered remains of the silvered gold from the well. This caused the silk to vibrate at a frequency that could induce a state of total paralysis in anyone who wore it for too long. It was a weapon of absolute stillness, sold under the guise of luxury to the courts of the West. Malik watched as the city began to eat its own history. He wrote of the golden silence that descended upon the market square. The traders would stand before their stalls, their hands moving in complex, silent patterns to negotiate prices. They were no longer trading for profit, but for time. They were using the gold from the well to buy a few more hours of existence before the desert reclaimed them. Malik's ledger details the exact amount of gold required to keep a human soul anchored to the physical plane for a single night. It was a precise mathematical bargain, a transaction between the living and the silenced. As the years pressed forward, the entries in the leopard skin grew more desperate. Malik described the physical sensation of the city drifting. He felt the ground beneath his villa lose its solidity, becoming more like a liquid than stone. This was the result of the acoustic hammering at the well. The vibration was loosening the very atoms of the reality they lived in. Malik wrote that the buildings were no longer casting shadows that matched their shapes. A tower would cast the shadow of a tree. A well would cast the shadow of a star. The geometry of the city was breaking, and the ledger was the only thing holding the logic together. The gold was the key. Malik claimed that the gold acted as a ballast. By filling the central well with millions of coins, the council was trying to weigh the city down, keeping it from floating away into the void. But the silence was stronger than the gold. The more they focused on the silence, the lighter the city became. Malik watched as the most senior merchants began to lose their physical weight entirely. They would float inches above the ground, their silk robes trailing behind them like the fins of deep-sea creatures. They were becoming the very silence they had harvested. Malik knew that his time was limited. He spent his final nights tracing the leopard skin ledger with his fingers, trying to memorize the names of the dead. He knew that when the sand eventually covered the city, these names would be the only thing left of the Tang Empire's most profitable era. He wrote of the final breath, a ritual where the entire population of the city would gather at the well to exhale in unison, surrendering their last connection to the world of sound. This was the moment the desert had been waiting for. The weaving of the silk was not a task of the hands, but a task of the lungs. Malik's ledger describes the workshops of the keepers of the thread as places of total, suffocating stillness. The looms were made of dark rosewood, but they lacked the traditional shuttles that clattered and banged against the frames. Instead, the weavers used their own breath to guide the silvered filaments through the warp and weft. Each thread was so fine it was nearly invisible to the naked eye, yet it possessed the strength of steel cable. Malik noted that the weavers would sit for days without moving, their chests barely rising as they exhaled the silence of their lives into the fabric. The blood-stained silk was not a metaphor for labor. It was a physical manifestation of the weaver's vital force being drained and woven into a sellable commodity. Malik observed that the more of this silk the city produced, the more the merchants themselves began to fade. He recorded an incident where a prominent tea merchant from the Fergana Valley attempted to buy a bolt of the crimson fabric. As soon as the merchant touched the silk, his hands became translucent. He could see his own bones, but they were no longer made of calcium and marrow. They were made of the same silvered gold that sat in the central well. The silk was a bridge, a conduit that allowed the void of the city to infect the physical bodies of those who sought to profit from it. Malik's ledger served as a warning that the Silk Road was no longer a path for commerce, but a conveyor belt for a psychological epidemic. This information storage was the secret of the silk. The fabric was a library. Each bolt contained the memories, the names, and the lost dreams of the people of Nia. Malik realized that the Tang Empire was not buying silk for its beauty. They were buying it to archive the souls of a population they could no longer control. The emperor's court in Chang'an was building a palace of silence, a monument made of the breath of the dead. Malik wrote that the silk would occasionally scream when the sun hit it at a certain angle. It was a low, vibrating cry that could only be heard by those who had already begun to lose their own voices. As the candle in your room burns lower, imagine the sensation of the silk against your skin. It would feel like a layer of cool water, but with a weight that pulls at your soul. It is the weight of 1,000 secrets all woven into a single, shimmering surface. Malik's entries become more erratic as he describes his own sense of touch beginning to fail. He could no longer feel the texture of the leopard skin. He could only feel the frequency of the ink as it dried on the page. He was becoming a record himself, a living ledger of a reality that was folding in on itself. The ledger also reveals the existence of the silent caravan. These were the 40 camels mentioned in the beginning, the beasts that were found standing upright in the sand centuries later. Malik was the one who prepared their packs. He did not fill them with water or food for the journey. He filled them with the silvered gold and the crimson silk. He knew they would never reach their destination. They were never meant to. They were sent out into the desert as a sacrifice, a final anchor to keep the void from expanding beyond the city walls. They were the sentinels of the silence, standing guard over a secret that had become too large for any one city to contain. Malik's final entries speak of the acoustic marriage. This was the moment when the frequency of the well and the frequency of the people became one. He wrote that the city was no longer a place of stone and wood, but a single massive crystal of silence. The people were the facets of the crystal, reflecting the light of the stars into the deep earth. He knew that the sand was coming, and he welcomed it. The sand was the only thing that could insulate the world from the sound of the city's heart. The final page of the leopard skin ledger contains no ink. Instead, Malik al-Shirazi used a sharp silver stylus to indent the hide with a series of geometric coordinates. These coordinates do not point to the Silk Road or any known oasis. They point to the gaps between the stars. As the sand began to pour over the walls of his villa, Malik recorded the sensation of the air becoming a solid. The silence was no longer an absence of sound, but a physical weight that pressed the breath from his lungs and turned it into the very silk he had spent his life accounting for. He realized in those final moments that the city of Nia was not being buried by the desert. It was being harvested by the earth. The sand was merely the shroud, a protective layer for a transformation that would take 1,000 years to complete. He closed the ledger and placed it beneath the floorboards, confident that the silence would guard it better than any army. This persistent hum is the echo of Malik's final accounting. It is the sound of a city that refused to die, but chose to change its state of matter. The discovery of the ledger in 1901 was not a lucky break for archaeology. It was the silence finally reaching out to find a new witness. Sir Orlstein and his team were merely the vessels for a story that has been waiting beneath the dunes for 12 centuries. The gold, the silk, and the silvered voices of the Tang merchants are still there, vibrating in the dark, waiting for a world that is quiet enough to understand their value. Malik knew that gold is temporary, but the truth of the void is eternal. As you drift into the deep, windowless towers of your own sleep, remember that the Silk Road still carries its secrets. The silence is your guardian now. Let it carry you back into the heart of the dunes, where the wind only whispers of what the king buried. The maps have been rolled away. The candle is out. The story of the merchant and his forbidden ledger ends in the stillness of the Taklamakan. But the silence of the desert is merely one chapter in the archive of the unseen, the secrets of the Silk Road are anchored in the sand. But to understand the true weight of Forbidden's knowledge, we must travel to the mountain peaks where the air is thin, and the monks discovered a truth that turned their hair white in a single night. What did they find in the cave beyond the clouds? And why did the Empire send 1,000 soldiers to seal the entrance with molten lead? The silence of the desert is but a prelude to the scream of the mountains. 1,000 Imperial soldiers stood in a circle on the frozen ridge of the Kunlun Mountains. They did not carry bows or spears. Instead, they hauled massive cauldrons of molten lead. The liquid metal glowed with a sick orange light against the blue ice. Their target was a single, narrow cave entrance. From within that darkness came a sound that was not a scream and not a chant. It was the sound of 1,000 tongues moving in a language that the atmosphere of this earth was never meant to hold. One by one, the monks of the Order of the Silvered Peak emerged from the shadows. They had entered the cave as young men in the prime of their lives. But as they stepped into the mountain air, their hair was as white as the surrounding glaciers. Their eyes were wide and fixed, reflecting a terror so profound that the lead soldiers refused to look them in the face. Without a word, the commanders ordered the pour. The molten lead cascaded down the stone, sealing the entrance, the monks, and the truth they had found inside. This was not an execution. It was a quarantine, a desperate attempt to stop a psychological contagion before it could descend from the clouds and unmake the empire. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. Imagine the flickering of a single candle against the cold stone walls of an archive that time forgot. We are moving away from the noise of the modern world, entering a space where the wind only whispers of what used to be. Listen closely to the rhythm of the mountain heart. The year was 756. The Tang Dynasty was shivering under the weight of the Inlushan rebellion. While the cities burned in the lowlands, a small group of scholars and monks fled westward. They were the keepers of the imperial library's most dangerous scrolls, the ones that spoke of the pre-dynastic void. They sought refuge in the highest reaches of the mountains, believing that the thin air and the crushing silence would provide a natural shield for their secrets. But the mountains were not empty. The Kunlun Range has always been more than stone and ice. In the ancient texts, it is described as the Pillar of Heaven, a place where the barrier between the physical and the metaphysical is worn thin by the constant grinding of the celestial spheres. The lead bearers were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They were a guild of engineers and alchemists who specialized in the containment of anomalous phenomena. As they climbed the jagged peaks, they encountered a landscape that seemed to be forgetting its own shape. The rocks were smooth where they should have been jagged. The snow fell upward in slow, rhythmic swirls. And in the center of this distortion sat the monastery of the monks with white hair. They had found a cave that predated the mountains themselves, a hollow space in the foundation of the world where the scream of the mountains originated. What the monks discovered inside that cave was not a monster or a god. It was a realization. They found that the human mind is built on a foundation of noise. Our thoughts, our languages, and our identities are all filters designed to drown out the fundamental frequency of the universe. Within that cave, the filter was removed. The air was so thin and the silence so absolute that they began to hear the scream. It was the sound of reality trying to hold itself together against the pressure of the void. In a single night, the weight of this knowledge stripped the color from their hair and the reason from their minds. The lead bearers moved with a mechanical precision that suggested they were no longer entirely human themselves. Their leather aprons were lined with sheets of beaten silver, and their faces were obscured by heavy copper masks that featured only narrow slits for the eyes. This was not merely for protection against the heat of the cauldrons. It was to prevent them from catching the gaze of the monks. The alchemists of the Tang court had warned that the truth found in the cave was not just auditory. It was a visual infection. To look into the eyes of a man who had heard the scream of the mountains was to invite the void into your own mind. As the lead hit the frozen ground, it hissed and spat, creating a thick, metallic vapor that hung in the thin air like a toxic veil. The monks did not resist. They stood in a row, their white hair whipping in the wind, their hands folded in their sleeves. They were waiting for the lead to rise. The monks had discovered that the mountain was not made of solid stone. Beneath the layers of granite and gneiss, the Kunlun Range was hollowed out by a network of crystalline veins that functioned as a massive geological resonator. When the wind blew at certain altitudes, it didn't just whistle. It vibrated through these crystals, creating the frequency known as the scream. For centuries, the Order had practiced a form of deep tissue meditation designed to harmonize the human nervous system with this mountain pulse. They believed they were reaching for enlightenment, but as they neared the source, they realized that enlightenment was simply the total dissolution of the self. The white hair was the physical result of the body's pigments being literally vibrated out of the hair follicles. This stabilization was the true purpose of the lead bearers. The empire did not fear the monks as rebels. They feared them as accidental saboteurs of reality. If the monks continued their meditation, the alchemists believed the frequency would intensify until it reached a critical mass, causing the mountains to literally vibrate into dust. The lead was an acoustic damper. By pouring thousands of pounds of molten metal into the cave, They were attempting to muzzle the mountain. They were trying to force the silence of the state upon the scream of the universe. As you breathe in the cool air of your own space, imagine the smell of the mountain. It is a scent of ozone and ancient ice, mixed with the acrid metallic tang of the lead. The silence here is not a lack of sound. It is a weight. It is the pressure of the mountain pressing against the monks, and the monks pressing back with the weight of their own occluded thoughts. They had lost the ability to use language because language is a tool for the finite. In the face of the infinite scream, there are no nouns. There are no verbs. There is only the continuous, rhythmic vibration of being. The commanders of the lead bearers used long iron poles to stir the cooling lead, ensuring that every crack in the stone was filled. They watched as the monks' feet were slowly encased in the silvered metal. The monks did not flinch as the heat touched their skin. Their nervous systems had been recalibrated by the cave. They no longer felt pain in the way a mortal man does. They felt only the frequency. They were becoming part of the seal themselves, a living foundation for the leaden barrier that would protect the empire from the truth of its own insignificance. The mystery of the mountain scream is not a question of what was found, but of what was lost. Every monk who stepped out of that cave had left their biography behind. Their memories of families, of the lush valleys of the south, and of the emperor's favors had been scribbled away by the resonance. They were empty vessels, and the empire intended to fill those vessels with lead. The psychological collapse was not a failure of the mind. It was the mind's natural response to a truth that it was never designed to hold. The commanders of the lead bearers were not just masters of physics, but masters of the human soul's architecture. They understood that the monks were no longer individuals, but had become a collective sensor for the mountain's frequency. In the cold blue light of the Kunlun peaks, the white-haired men stood perfectly still as the lead rose to their knees. They did not look down. Their eyes remained fixed on the horizon, toward a point in space that only they could see. The alchemists believed that by sealing these men in a heavy grounding metal, they were anchoring the frequency of the void to the physical earth, preventing it from floating away and infecting the consciousness of the entire Tang Dynasty. The molten lead was acting as a heat sink for the metaphysical energy of the scream. The alchemical records of the court suggest that the molten lead was not pure. It was infused with powdered cinnabar and the scales of deep-sea creatures, materials meant to bridge the gap between the fire of the earth and the cold of the mountain. As the lead hardened, it created a sarcophagus that was not meant to keep the monks in, but to keep the sound out. The monks were the living conductors, and the lead was the insulation. Imagine the sound of the wind as it scours the leaden mass. It no longer screams. It produces a dull, rhythmic thud, like a giant heart beating in the center of the ice. The mountain had been pacified, but at the cost of the Order's humanity. Why did the Empire choose such a brutal method of containment? The answer lies in the fragility of the Tang social order during the rebellion. The Emperor understood that if word got out that the foundation of the world was a hollow, screaming void, the mandate of heaven would dissolve instantly. The people obeyed the emperor because they believed the world was a stable, meaningful place governed by cosmic law. The monks had found that the law was an illusion. They had seen that the universe was not a palace but a wound. To protect the lie of civilization, the lead soldiers had to silence the truth of the mountain. As you drift closer to the edge of your own awareness, consider the weight of that lead. It is the weight of every secret that has ever been buried to keep a kingdom from falling. It is the weight of the silence that you feel in your own room when the world outside has finally gone quiet. The lead is not just on the mountain. It is in the history we are taught and the maps we are given. We are told the mountains are just stone and the wind is just air. But the monks with the white hair knew better. They knew that the stone is a shell and the wind is a voice that has forgotten its name. The lead bearers remained on the ridge for 40 days and 40 nights, watching the seal. They waited for the frequency to die down, for the humming in their own copper masks to cease. When the lead was finally as cold as the surrounding ice, they carved a single, forbidden sigil into the surface. It was a warning to the future, a sign that this ground was no longer part of the empire, but a quarantined pocket of the void. They left the monks standing there, silvered statues in a landscape of blue, and they never spoke of the mission again. Every soldier who returned to the capital was given a new identity and a pension of silence, enforced by the same lead they had poured onto. The mountain. The legacy of the lead bearers is not found in the history books of the Tang Dynasty, but in the specific, heavy silence that remains at high altitudes. The mountain did not forget the monks, and the lead did not truly silence the scream. Instead, the metal acted as a lens, focusing the frequency into a singular, vertical beam that points directly toward the center of our galaxy. Modern climbers who venture near the restricted zones of the Kunlun Range often speak of a psychological phenomenon known as the silvered shadow. They claim that when the moon is full, the shadows of the rocks do not fall away from the light, but toward it. They describe a sensation of their own thoughts being pulled out of their heads, as if the mountain is still trying to harvest the noise of the living to feed its ancient, hollow heart. This persistent warmth is the final defiance of the white-haired monks. They may be encased in lead, but they have become the pulse of the mountain itself. The alchemists of the past failed to realize that you cannot destroy a frequency by covering it with metal. You only give it a physical body. The monks are now the conductors of a geological orchestra that plays a song of the void every time the earth shifts. We are living in the echo of their discovery. The psychological collapse of the trading empire was not caused by the rebellion of men, but by the realization that our civilization is a thin crust of noise, floating on an ocean of screaming silence. As you drift into the deep, windowless towers of your own sleep, remember the soldiers on the ridge. They thought they were sealing a cave, but they were actually building a monument to the things we are not allowed to know. The lid is cold, and the mountain is high, and the monks are finally at peace in their silvered tombs. The wind has stopped its screaming, and the stars are silent in their ancient paths. The story of the mountain ends here, in the cold, gray light of the leaden seal. But the archive of the unseen is vast, and the silence of the heights is merely a gateway to a deeper mystery. Buried in the heart of the desert, the scream of the mountains has been dampened by the weight of the lead. But the true source of the void was never in the ice. It was always in the center of the city we chose to forget. To understand why the empire risked everything to seal the peaks, we must return to the shifting sands of the Taklamakan. We must look into the darkness of the city's foundation. Beneath the windowless towers and the silvered mirrors lies a discovery that the merchant Moloch only hinted at in his Forbidden Ledger. What is the true nature of the idol in the central well? And why did every person who looked upon it lose the ability to speak their own name? The silence of the mountain leads us back to the heart of the sand. The Council of Merchants did not bury the idol because they feared a curse or a primitive superstition. They buried it because it was functioning with a lethal, with terrifying efficiency. In the final days of the city of Nia, the wealthiest traders of the Silk Road realized that their greatest asset had become their ultimate betrayer. The idol, a towering pillar of fused obsidian and silvered glass resting at the bottom of the central well, was not a statue of a god. It was a biological and acoustic siphon. It had begun to harvest the very identities of those who stood near it, pulling the names, the memories, and the voices out of their throats and storing them in its cold, crystalline structure. The council found their fellow merchants standing over the well, staring into the abyss with hollow, milky eyes, unable to remember their wives, their children, or the gold they had spent a lifetime accumulating. To save the empire from a psychological collapse that would turn every citizen into a mindless husk, the council ordered 1,000 tons of sand and lead to be poured into the shaft. They committed a grand betrayal of history, choosing to erase their most powerful relic rather than allow it to consume the reality of the Tang Dynasty. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. Imagine the flickering of a single candle against the cold stone walls of an archive that time forgot. We are moving away from the noise of the modern world, entering a space where the wind only whispers of what used to be. Listen closely to the rhythm of the desert heart. The central well of Nea was always considered the spiritual and economic axis of the Taklamakan. In a land where water is more precious than rubies, the well was the source of life. But as the archaeologists of the 20th century would later discover, the shaft did not tap into a subterranean river. It tapped into a pocket of the deep earth that remained untouched since the dawn of time. The masonry of the well was not standard Tang construction. The stones were fitted together with a precision that left no room for mortar, each block of black basalt polished to a mirror finish. This was the chamber of the idol, a relic that the merchants believed was a gift from an antediluvian civilization, but which was actually a sentinel of the void for decades. The city of Nia prospered because of the idol. The council of merchants found that if they whispered their trade secrets into the well, the idol would resonate, providing them with visions of future markets and the movements of distant caravans. It was a machine for prophecy, a tool for infinite wealth. But the idol required a specific kind of fuel. It did not want blood or gold. It wanted the sound of the human soul. Every word whispered into the well was a piece of the speaker's self that was permanently surrendered. The more the merchants gained in wealth, the less they remained of themselves. They were becoming hollowed out, their personalities thinning like the worn silk they traded. This deliberate packing was the council's final act of desperation. They had seen the transformation of the High Governor, a man of legendary intellect who, after a single night at the well, could no longer recognize his own reflection. He spent his remaining days tracing the patterns of the desert floor, his voice reduced to a repetitive mechanical hum. The idol was not just taking memories. It was rewriting the human nervous system to match its own cold geometric logic. The city was no longer a hub of culture and life. It was a processing plant for the void, and the merchants were the raw material. The council held a secret session in a windowless tower, their faces masked to prevent the idol from recognizing them. They realized that the Silk Road was being infected by this silence. Every caravan that left Nia carried a piece of the idol's resonance within the goods they transported. The silence was spreading like a plague of the mind. To stop the infection, they had to cut off the source. They had to bury the idol so deep that even the memory of its location would be lost to the wains of the Taklamakan. They gathered the silvered gold and the lead from the northern mines, preparing for a ritual of burial that would require the sacrifice of their own history. Imagine the sound of the wind as it scours the rim of that black basalt shaft. It is a sound of mourning, but also a sound of terrifying hunger. The idol was waiting for the council. It knew they were coming with their lead and their sand. It began to vibrate, its frequency reaching out through the foundations of the city, causing the very stones of the villas to weep a dark, salty moisture. The battle for the city was not fought with swords, but with the power of the unspoken. The merchants had to remain perfectly silent as they poured the lead, for a single spoken word would give the idol the leverage it needed to pull them all into the abyss. The night of the burial was a night of long shadows and absolute, suffocating restraint. The Council of Merchants had recruited a specialized labor force from the edges of the Gobi, men whose tongues had been ritually bound since childhood to prevent any accidental leakage of the soul. These laborers carried heavy jars of molten lead with a rhythmic, swaying gait. They moved through the narrow, spiraling streets of Nia like a line of ghosts. Their leather sandals made no sound against the salt-encrusted clay. Above them, the stars were cold and sharp, white needles in a sky that felt increasingly fragile, as if the city was no longer anchored to the rotation of the earth. Every step toward the well was a struggle against a physical repulsion. It was as if the air itself was trying to push them back. A pressure that felt like walking through deep, freezing water. As the first jar of lead was tilted over the lip of the basalt shaft, the air within the city seemed to buckle. There was no sound of a splash. Instead, a low, tectonic vibration surged upward from the deep earth, a frequency so heavy it was felt in the marrow of the workers' teeth. The lead did not flow like a liquid. It was pulled downward as if the vacuum within the well was hungrier than the weight of the metal. The council members stood in a distant circle, their faces pale beneath their masks. They were witnessing the systematic execution of their own prosperity. They knew that by sealing the well, they were cutting the cord that had fed the city's wealth for generations. But they also knew that the cord had become a noose. The idol, sensing the coming darkness, began to pulse with a luminosity that was not light, but a clarity of space. The air inside the well became so transparent that the workers could see the very curvature of the planet beneath them. They saw the roots of the mountains and the veins of the earth, all glowing with the same silvered frequency that had infected the merchants. This was the idol's last defense, a final revelation of the absolute that was intended to paralyze the will of the living. To see such a thing is to lose interest in the world of men. It is a psychological vertigo that makes the act of breathing feel like a heavy, unnecessary chore. Many of the laborers paused, their jars suspended in the air, their minds beginning to dissolve into the crystalline beauty of the void. The high priest of the council, a man whose name has been meticulously scraped from the surviving wooden tablets, was the only one allowed to stand at the very edge of the abyss. He carried a staff made of weathered mulberry wood, capped with a sphere of lead that had been cooled in the waters of the Oxus River as the lead poured into the well. He began to trace a series of geometric patterns in the air, his movements slow and deliberate. These were the anti-resonances, the shapes that would cancel out the idol's frequency. He was not speaking, but his body was a conductor for the silence he had cultivated through decades of isolation. The pressure in the central square grew so intense that the masonry of the surrounding villas began to crack. shedding their salt-crusted layers like dying skin. The workers felt a rhythmic thrumming in their lungs, as if the idol was trying to breathe through them. Using their heartbeats as a metronome for its own survival, the council had realized that lead alone was not enough. Lead could dampen the sound, but it could not stop the extraction of the soul. For that, they needed the weight of the desert itself. They had gathered 1,000 tons of sand from the deepest, most desolate parts of the Taklamakan, sand that had never felt the shadow of a bird or the moisture of a cloud. This sand was believed to be dead, a material that possessed a high psychological resistance to the void. As the lead began to solidify in the lower reaches of the well, the council signaled for the sand to be released. It fell into the shaft in a continuous, heavy stream, a curtain of gold and gray that hissed like 1,000 serpents. This was the true burial, the burying of a truth that was too heavy for any empire to carry. The burial of the idol was not just a physical act. It was a psychological amputation. Every merchant who participated in the ritual knew that they were losing a piece of their history. The memories that the idol had already harvested were being permanently sealed away. The names of their ancestors, the locations of their hidden caches of gems, and the maps of the secret oases were all dissolving into the lead and the sand. They were choosing a future of ignorance over a present of total mental disintegration. The city of Nia, which had once been a lighthouse of knowledge on the Silk Road, was becoming a vault of the forgotten. The council watched as the sand rose higher and higher, covering the black basalt stones and the silvered glass of the well's interior. They felt a sense of profound mourning, a grief that had no words and no voice. As you lie in the quiet of your own space, imagine the weight of that 1,000 tons of sand. It is a weight that silences the mind. It is the weight of a long, dreamless sleep. The Taklamakan is a sea of such silences, a landscape where the past is not dead, but merely buried beneath a weight that the present cannot lift. The idol is still there, beneath the lead and the sand, its frequency muted but not destroyed. It is waiting for the wind to shift, for the sand to move, for a voice to speak its name once again. But for now, the silence is your guardian. It is the blanket that protects you from the secrets of the deep earth. The workers continued their swaying rhythm, their bodies moved by a logic that was no longer their own. They were the components of a ritual that spanned across generations. The lead was the anchor, the sand was the shroud, and their silence was the seal. They knew that when the sun rose, they would no longer remember why they were there. They would wake up with hollow eyes and a feeling of heavy peace, their names a distant echo in the back of their minds. The city of silence was finally living up to its name, a monument to the things we must forget to stay alive. The final layer of the burial was not made of metal or sand, but of something far more elusive. The Council of Merchants ordered that the surface above the well be paved with the silvered mirrors of the windowless towers. These were the same mirrors that had once captured the lunar light to fuel the idol's hunger. Now they were turned face down into the dirt. The theory was one of optical and psychic reflection. By facing the mirrors toward the buried idol, the council hoped to create a feedback loop of the void, forcing the entity to consume its own resonance rather than reaching outward for the souls of the living. As the mirrors were laid, the workers felt a sudden, sharp relief. The atmospheric pressure that had been crushing their lungs for hours dissipated in an instant. The air grew light, almost unnaturally so, as if the city itself had suddenly lost its gravity. The heavy, rhythmic thrumming of the deep earth went silent. It was a silence so profound that many of the men wept without knowing why. their tears falling onto the cold glass of the inverted mirrors. This was the moment of the great severance. For the first time in centuries, the people of Nia were no longer tethered to the basalt shaft. But the freedom was a terrifying one. Without the idol's frequency to anchor them, the inhabitants found that their sense of time began to unravel. Minutes felt like hours, and years felt like passing shadows. The psychological collapse was not a slow decay, but a sudden vertical drop into the unknown. They stood in their doorways, looking at the stars, and realized that they no longer knew how to read the maps of the heavens. The idol had been their compass, and now they were adrift in a desert that had no center. The council had saved their souls, but they had left them in a void of their own making. The discovery of these mirror rooms reveals the true extent of the paranoia that gripped the city's elite. They were living in a fortress of reflection, trying to bounce the silence away from their families. But as the council completed the burial, they realized that the mirrors were also recording the history of the city's end. Every face that looked into those silvered surfaces during the ritual was etched into the glass. The mirrors became a gallery of the forgotten, a visual archive of a civilization that was deleting itself. The high priest placed the final mirror in the center of the square, right above the axis of the basalt shaft. He did not look into it. He knew that to see his own reflection at that moment would be to see the face of the void itself. He simply turned it over, sealing the city's destiny beneath a layer of dark. Silent glass dot as the desert wind began to pick up, carrying the first grains of the sandstorm that would eventually hide the city for a millennium. The Council of Merchants gathered their remaining gold. They were not leaving as wealthy men. They were leaving as refugees of the mind. They carried with them only the most basic tools for survival, leaving behind the silk, the spices, and the heavy, blood-stained ledgers of their trade. They understood that to carry anything from Nia was to carry a piece of the infection. They walked out of the gates in a single file, never looking back. They were the architects of the silence, and they were now its first victims. Their journey across the Taklamakan was a journey into a world that no longer made sense. The mystery of the mirrors is the mystery of the city's persistence. Even buried under 1,000 tons of sand and lead, the idol continues to operate through the glass. It is a machine that uses light and memory as its fuel. The council thought they were ending the story, but they were actually preserving it in a state of crystalline suspension. The sandstorm that followed the burial lasted for 40 days, a wall of dust that reached the clouds. When it finally settled, the city of Nia was gone. The towers were buried, the gates were sealed, and the central square was a flat expanse of dunes. The Silk Road shifted its path, the caravans finding new routes through the northern oases. The silence had one dot. The modern world looks at the Taklamakan and sees only a void of heat. But to the physicists who study the magnetic anomalies of the Silk Road, the central well at Nia remains a point of intense interest. The leaden seal and the inverted mirrors have not dissolved. Instead, they have merged with the bedrock, creating a singular metallic core that vibrates at a frequency far below human hearing. It is a tectonic whisper, a reminder that the Council's betrayal was successful. They buried the idol, but in doing so, they gave it a body of stone that will outlast the memory of the Tang Dynasty. We are walking upon the roof of a library that we are no longer permitted to read. As you drift into the final layers of your own sleep, imagine the weight of the silence over that basalt shaft. It is a piece bought at a terrible price. The merchants and the lead bearers are all part of the sand now, their identities harvested by the machine they tried to hide. but the frequency remains. It is the hum in your ears when the room is quiet. It is the sensation of a name being on the tip of your tongue only to vanish. The idol is not gone. It has simply moved inside the silence of our history. The maps have been rolled away. The candle has flickered into darkness. The story of the idol in the central well ends here in the cold desert night. But the archive of the unseen is vast, and the silence of the desert is merely a prelude to the deepest secret of all. The Council of Merchants buried the idol to save their souls. But they did not realize that the idol was merely a guardian for something far more terrifying. To understand the true source of the Silk Road's power, we must descend into the black tunnels of the East. What did the imperial miners find beneath the roots of the world that was so beautiful it caused them to sew their eyes shut? Why did the emperor decree that the location of the Iron Gate be struck from every map? The silence of the desert is ending, and the echo of the Iron Gate is about to begin. The miners of the eastern frontier did not lose their sight to the darkness of the earth or the flickering of their oil lamps. They chose to sew their eyelids shut with threads of raw silk to preserve the last thing they had seen. Deep beneath the roots of the mountain range known as the Iron Gate, a specialized imperial excavation team found a structural anomaly that defied the laws of mineralogy and light. They discovered a chamber where the stone had turned to a transparent, vibrating glass, revealing a network of luminous veins that pulsed with the rhythm of a breathing planet. But it was not the beauty that terrified them. It was the realization that the light was a language. Every pulse of the veins was a syllable of a truth so profound and so alien that it began to overwrite their memories of home, family, and the emperor himself. They saw the blueprint of the world's end, a geometric betrayal of everything they believed to be solid. To save their souls from being completely consumed by this vision, they committed an act of horrific devotion, sealing their eyes forever before the imperial soldiers arrived with cauldrons of molten lead to bury the entrance. The emperor decreed that the Iron Gate be struck from every map, and that the names of the 300 miners be cursed into oblivion. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. Imagine the flickering of a single candle against the cold stone walls of an archive that time forgot. We are moving away from the noise of the modern world, entering a space where the wind only whispers of what used to be. Listen closely to the rhythm of the mountain heart. The Iron Gate, known to the locals as the Buzgala Khana, was always a place of heavy superstition. It was a narrow pass that served as the primary artery for the Tang Dynasty's expansion into the west, but the mountains held secrets that the tax collectors and the silk merchants were never meant to uncover. In the year 742, a group of convicts and military engineers was sent into the deepest gorges to find a new vein of magnetite. The empire needed iron for its armies, but what they found was a gateway of a different kind. As they tunneled into the black granite, the temperature began to rise, not from the heat of the Earth's core, but from a localized resonance that caused their iron tools to glow with a faint blue phosphorescence. The descent into the Iron Gate was a descent into a psychological labyrinth. The miners reported that the deeper they went, the less they felt the weight of the stone above them. The gravity seemed to fluctuate, the air becoming thick and sweet like mountain honey. They found themselves in a cavern where the roots of the ancient cedars had pierced through the ceiling, but the wood had been transformed. The roots were no longer organic matter. They had been replaced by a substance that looked like liquid silver flowing upward toward the surface. This was the glow of the roots, a phenomenon that the high alchemists believed was the circulatory system of the world's hidden intelligence. The blind battalion moved with a mechanical precision, guided by the echoes of their own staves against the granite walls. They were the shadows of the Tang military machine, men whose utility to the state was defined by their inability to witness the forbiddance. In the depths of the Iron Gate, they encountered the miners who were no longer men, but living components of the glass chamber. The silk thread used to sew their eyes shut had turned to shimmering, crystalline white, reflecting the pulses of the silver roots. The atmosphere in the cavern was no longer composed of air, but of a thick, static electricity that tasted of copper and ancient dust. The miners sat in a state of suspended animation, their hearts beating only once every few minutes, their breath as shallow as the morning mist. They had become the resonators for the mountain, their physical bodies acting as the bridge between the human world and the glass. Foundation. The systematic erasure of the Iron Gate from the Imperial Archives was a masterpiece of administrative cruelty. The Bureau of Records did not merely destroy the documents, they replaced them with fabrications. They created a history where the Durban Pass was always an impassable cliff, where no miner had ever set foot and no iron had ever been found. They understood that to delete a place, you must also delete the desire to go there. Every merchant who had traveled the route was visited by the secret police, forced to sign a confession of madness or face the executioner's blade. The Tang Dynasty was no longer just governing the land. They were governing the memory of the land, ensuring that the silence of the records was as absolute as the stone of the mountains. The emperor understood that power lies not in what is remembered, but in what is successfully forgotten. The alchemists in the capital were obsessed with the samples of the silver roots that the soldiers had managed to recover. They found that the metal was not an element found on the periodic table of the ancient world. It was a conductive material that responded to the sound of the human voice. When a person spoke near the silver, the metal would ripple and shift, mimicking the frequency of the words. It was as if the roots were waiting for a command, a key that would unlock the final transformation of the earth. The emperor, fearing that his own voice would become the catalyst for the world's unmaking, ordered the silver to be cast into the base of his throne, trapping the roots in a cage of gold and precious gems. But the silence of the Tang Dynasty was a fragile thing. A veil of paper and ink stretched over a foundation of vibrating glass dot as you drift further into the stillness of the night. Consider the weight of a secret that can cause an empire to rewrite its own maps. The Iron Gate was not just a geographic location. It was a wound in the narrative of the world. The miners who chose to blind themselves were not acting out of fear, but out of a desperate, final form of protection. They knew that once you see the language of the glass, you can never go back to the simple truths of the sun and the moon. Your mind becomes a library of the void, a place where the noise of the world is replaced by the rhythmic, terrifying pulse of the silver roots. The silence of the Tang Dynasty was the only mercy the state could offer. The erasure of the miners was only the beginning of the imperial purge. Once the Iron Gate was sealed, the emperor's paranoia turned toward the scholars who had translated the initial reports. These were men who had spent their lives in the quiet of the Hanlin Academy, surrounded by the wisdom of the ancients. But when the reports from the Iron Gate arrived, they found that their classical vocabulary was insufficient to describe what had been unearthed. They began to invent new characters, strokes that looked more like the jagged lines of a mountain ridge than the elegant flow of traditional calligraphy. These scholars reported a persistent ringing in their ears, a sound that they described as the stone itself trying to breathe through the paper. They were the first to understand that the silence of the state was not a punishment but a desperate, failing shield. The emperor ordered the burning of the Crimson Scrolls, a collection of secret diaries. Kept by the architects who had originally mapped the Durban Pass, these men were not merely builders. They were geomancers who understood the flow of energy through the Earth's crust. Their journals contained detailed sketches of the Iron Gate, but with a terrifying addition. They had mapped a series of tunnels that did not follow the paths of natural erosion. Instead, the tunnels formed a perfect interlocking grid that spanned the entire western frontier. It was as if the mountains were not a natural formation, but a massive structural lid placed over something that had been buried long before. The first dynasty ever rose to power. The geomancers who had drawn these maps were gathered in a central courtyard in Chang'an and given a choice. They could drink from a silver chalice containing a tincture of hemlock and lead, or they could serve as the new guardians of the sealed gate. Their families held as collateral for their silence. Most chose the chalice. They knew that once you have seen the grid beneath the mountains, you can never look at a landscape again without seeing the architecture of the void. The few who went back to the mountains were never seen again. Their names were removed from the census, their ancestral homes burned to the ground, and their lineage declared a historical fiction. The psychological layer of the purge was the most effective. The emperor realized that you cannot just kill people to keep a secret. You must kill the idea of the secret itself. He commissioned a series of plays and poems that glorified the solid nature of the earth, reinforcing the belief that the world was an unchanging, unmoving foundation of stone and soil. Any artistic work that hinted at the fluidity of reality or the existence of the silver roots was categorized as a form of madness. The people of the Tang Dynasty began to police their own thoughts, fearing the silence that had taken the miners and the scholars. The Iron Gate became a ghost in the collective consciousness, a place that everyone knew was there, but no one dared to name as the candle in your room burns lower. Consider the sensation of living in a world where the maps are lies. You walk across a bridge and you are told the water beneath it is just water. You climb a mountain and you are told the stone is just stone. But in the back of your mind there is a vibration, a faint rhythmic pulse that reminds you of the silver roots. You start to notice that the shadows of the trees don't always move with the wind. You see a glimmer of light in a dark cave that shouldn't be there. The silence of the Tang Dynasty is a heavy blanket, but the truth beneath it is still breathing, still waiting for someone to listen to the stone. The final act of the imperial purge was not a fire or a sword, but a slow, methodical silencing of the land itself. The blind battalion remained at the Iron Gate for 3 full years after the lead had cooled. They were the only witnesses to the mountain's new, artificial peace. They did not speak to one another, their communication reduced to a series of rhythmic taps on the stone, a code that mirrored the pulses of the silver roots they had buried deep within the glass foundation. As their hair turned the same crystalline white as the miners before them, they realized that they were no longer guardians of a gate, but the final pages of a book that was being burned in real time. The emperor had achieved his goal. The Iron Gate was no longer a place of transit or iron, but a fortress of the unspoken. a hole in the geography of the world that would take 1,000 years to heal. They watched the seasons change in a blur of gray and silver, their copper masks growing green with the mountain oxidation, until they became indistinguishable from the statues the miners had become. This map was the final confession of an empire that had seen the truth of the glass foundation and decided to turn away. The blind battalion eventually vanished into the mist of the high passes, their white hair blending with the snow, their staves continuing to tap a rhythm that only the stones could hear. They were the first to understand that you cannot truly delete a secret. You can only bury it in a layer of silence so thick that it becomes its own reality. The silver roots are still there, vibrating beneath the lead and the basalt, waiting for a time when the noise of the world is quiet enough for their language to be understood again. The emperor's throne, with its hidden silver foundation, was eventually lost in the chaos of the dynasty's fall. But the frequency it captured continues to ripple through the history of the East, a silent current that influences the dreams of those who sleep near the ancient capital. As you reach the edge of your own rest, remember the blind battalion and the miners who chose the darkness. They were the martyrs of the silence, the men who protected the world by refusing to witness its unmaking. The Tang Dynasty fell, the maps were rewritten, and the iron was forgotten, but the vibration remains. It is the hum of the mountains when the wind is still. It is the weight of the night when you realize that the world is much deeper and much older than the stories we are told. The lead is cold, the stone is heavy, and the silver roots are finally at peace beneath the weight of 1,000 years of forgotten history. You are safe in the silence they created, a silence that has guarded the world since the day the Iron Gate was struck from the map. The silence of the Tang Dynasty was a wall of paper, but the truth it protected has begun to leak through the cracks of time. We have followed the silver roots to the mountain's heart, but the true source of the world's distortion lies not in stone, but in the water. To understand why the imperial fleet was ordered to scuttle itself in the middle of a calm sea, we must travel to the Emerald Abyss. What did the admiral see beneath the waves that was so beautiful it made him order his men to drown their own maps? Why did the emperor decree that the sea itself be declared a forbidden territory? The silence of the mountains is over, and the echo of the deep is about to begin. In 1902, the Swedish explorer Sven Hedin returned from the Taklamakan Desert with a lead-line crate that was never intended to be opened by the eyes of the public. While the scientific world celebrated his meticulously drawn maps of the Silk Road, the Swedish Royal Academy was secretly incinerating 42 glass plate negatives that captured a crystalline nightmare. These were not mere images of sand-swept ruins or fragments of ancient pottery. They were photographs of the inhabitants of Nia, standing perfectly upright within their windowless villas, their eyes wide and shimmering with a silvered glaze as if their very souls had been transmuted into glass in a single, silent heartbeat. Hedin's private journals, recovered decades later from a hidden vault in Stockholm, reveal a horrific betrayal of the scientific mandate. He had not merely discovered a lost city, he had stumbled upon a biological and temporal anomaly that shattered the fundamental laws of entropy and life. The photographs captured shadows that had become detached from their owners, creeping across the clay walls like spilled ink in a dark pool. To prevent a global collapse of reason and to shield the Swedish crown from a perceived supernatural curse, the Royal Academy declared the expedition's visual records a state secret of the highest order. Every photographer and assistant who had peered through the lens was coerced into a life of isolation or confined to psychiatric institutions to ensure the silence remained absolute. Hedin himself spent his twilight years attempting to burn the memory of the very discovery that should have made him immortal. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. Imagine the flickering of a single candle against the cold stone walls of an archive that time forgot. We are moving away from the noise of the modern world, entering a space where the wind only whispers of what used to be. Listen closely to the rhythm of the desert heart. The Taklamakan Desert is a landscape of shifting mirrors, a place where the sun and the salt conspire to play tricks on the human mind. But for the Swedish expedition of 1902, the hallucinations were not born of heat, but of a terrifying reality. As Sven Hedin led his caravan through the shifting dunes of the southern Tarim Basin, they encountered the skeletal remains of Naya, a city that appeared to have been deleted from the records of the Tang Dynasty in a single day. The architecture was preserved with a fidelity that felt predatory. The timber beams of the houses were not rotted. They were petrified into a substance that felt like cold bone. As the team set up their heavy plate cameras, they noticed a strange distortion in the silver nitrate emulsion. The air around the ruins seemed to hum with a low-frequency vibration that caused the glass plates to crack spontaneously within their holders. The photographs that were preserved in the secret archives show a city that was not abandoned but frozen. In one particularly haunting plate, a woman is captured standing at her loom, her hands poised as if to throw a shuttle that is no longer there. Her skin is not the parched leather of a desert mummy. It is smooth and translucent, reflecting the light of the magnesium flash with a metallic sheen. The researchers who have analyzed the surviving fragments of these images in the modern era note that there are no flies, no dust, and no signs of the passage of 12 centuries on her clothing. It is as if the camera did not capture a past moment, but a persistent, vibrating present. The camera lens, a Zeiss proto-lens specifically calibrated for the expedition, seemed to penetrate a veil that the human eye could not perceive. The shadows in the photographs do not align with the position of the sun. They appear to be stretching toward the central well of the city, pulling at the feet of the frozen inhabitants, as if trying to drag them back into the deep earth. As the expedition ventured deeper into the heart of Nia, the psychological strain began to manifest in the physical world. The photographers reported a sensation of being watched not by eyes, but by the very stones of the ruins. The light in the desert seemed to lose its warmth, turning into a sterile, surgical illumination that stripped the color from their equipment and their skin. Sven Hedin recorded in his private ledger that the air within the city felt like a physical weight, a thick, invisible membrane that muffled their voices and slowed their movements. It was as if they were moving through a liquid that was gradually hardening around them. The glass plates captured this density. In the developed negatives, the air itself appears textured, filled with a fine, shimmering particulate that resembles pulverized diamonds or frozen breath. This was the first evidence of the crystalline contagion, a state where the boundaries between biological life and mineral stillness begin to blur. The fragments mentioned in the secret records were not geological in origin. They were shards of what appeared to be human remains that had undergone a total molecular restructuring. One of Hedin's assistants, a man named Eriksson, discovered a small nursery in a well-preserved villa. On the floor lay what appeared to be a child's toy, a wooden bird. But when he touched it, the wood shattered like fine crystal, revealing a core of shimmering silvered glass. This was the true scandal of the 1902 expedition. Hedden had found evidence that the inhabitants of Nia had not died of thirst or war. They had been transformed. Their bodies had become the conduit for a frequency that turned carbon into silica, a process of biological crystallization that moved with the silence of a growing shadow. The photographs captured the terrifying beauty of this transition. In one image, a hand is reaching for a door handle. The fingertips are already transparent, the bones within visible and glowing with a faint internal light. The rest of the arm is still flesh, but it is covered in a fine network of frost-like patterns that seem to be growing toward the shoulder. This was the glass fever that Hedden described in his most guarded letters. He watched as his own reflection in the camera's viewfinder began to change, his eyes taking on a depth and a clarity that made it impossible for him to sleep. He felt the silence of the city beginning to take root in his own mind, a rhythmic, geometric pulsing that replaced the chaotic noise of human thought. The psychological layer of the expedition became a battle for the preservation of the self. Hedden realized that the act of witnessing the city was the very thing that triggered the transformation. The camera lens was a bridge, a way for the frequency of Nia to travel from the ruins and into the eye of the observer. Every time the magnesium flash illuminated a room, it was like a lightning bolt in a dark room, temporarily freezing the contagion in place. But the light was also a fuel. The inhabitants seemed to thrive on the flash, their crystalline skin glowing brighter with every exposure. Hedden began to fear that by photographing the city, he was not just documenting its end, but accelerating it. He was a scientist who had accidentally become a catalyst for a nightmare. As you drift closer to the edge of your own sleep, imagine the sound of that silence. It is not the absence of sound, but the presence of a weight. It is the sound of the desert trying to breathe through your own lungs. The Swedish explorers felt this weight in every bone of their bodies. They felt the silver glass beginning to form in the corners of their vision. They were the first modern men to look into the void of the Silk Road and see that the void was looking back with eyes made of ancient, cold crystal. The scandal was not just the photos they hid, but the part of themselves they left behind in the sand. The retreat from Nia was not a triumphant return, but a desperate flight from a mounting psychic pressure. As the camels groaned under the weight of the lead-lined crates, Sven Hedden noticed that the very animals seemed to sense the wrongness of their cargo. They moved with a hesitant, jerky rhythm, their eyes fixed on the horizon as if searching for an escape from the silent vibration emanating from the glass plates. In the makeshift dark rooms of their nightly camps, the expedition's lead photographer, a man of iron nerves named Josephson, began to experience a total fracture of his reality. As he bathed the glass plates in the pungent chemicals of the developer, he did not see the ruins of a city. He saw a gateway. The red light of the safety lantern cast deep, bloody shadows across the developing images, making the frozen inhabitants of Nia appear to breathe. Josephson claimed that the silver nitrate was not just capturing light, but was being replaced by the silvered blood of the city itself. He could hear a sound coming from the trays, a high-pitched, crystalline ringing that mirrored the hum of the central well they had left behind. The liquid in the trays began to glow with a faint, bioluminescent hue, illuminating the small, cramped tent with a ghostly radiance that left no room for the comfort of the dark. The photographs were the evidence of a crime against nature. In one plate, which was allegedly destroyed by the king's own hand, Hedden had captured a view of the city square at dawn. The shadows of the towers were not cast on the ground. They were cast upward into the air, creating a dark, geometric forest that seemed to support the sky. In the center of this forest stood the Council of Merchants, their robes flowing in a wind that did not exist. Their faces were turned toward the camera, and even in the grainy, black and white medium, their eyes were luminous. They were not looking at Hedin. They were looking through the camera, through the glass, and directly into the future. They were witnesses to the very moment their secret would be rediscovered. Josephson became so disturbed by this image that he attempted to wash the emulsion off the plate with his bare hands. He found that the image was not on the surface of the glass, but was fused into the very center of the pane, a permanent ghost trapped within the silica. The psychological weight of the unpublished plates began to consume the morale of the entire caravan. The local guides, who had lived on the edge of the Taklamakan for generations, refused to touch the crates. They spoke of the skin stealers, entities that lived in the sand and required a human face to manifest in the physical world. They believed that the cameras were not taking pictures, but were providing the desert with a template for our reality. Every time a photograph was taken, a piece of the world was traded for a piece of the void. Sven Hedin, caught between his scientific ambition and his mounting dread, began to censor his own findings. He started to edit the reality of the expedition, removing the mentions of the silvered eyes and the glass birds from the official logs. He was creating the first layer of the silence that would eventually bury the truth of Nia for 100 years. He realized that some truths are too heavy for the world of men, and that the duty of the scientist is sometimes to burn the evidence of his own eyes. The return to Stockholm was not marked by the cheering crowds that usually greeted a conquering explorer. Instead, the crates were moved in the dead of night to the deepest basements of the Riksarkivet, the National Archives. King Oscar II, after viewing a single projection of the Nia plates in a private chamber, reportedly ordered the immediate destruction of the negatives. He saw in the silvered eyes of the merchants not a lost civilization, but a mirror reflecting the inevitable end of all empires. Josephson, the man who had breathed the fumes of the silvered blood, never spoke another word of Swedish. He was committed to a private sanitarium on the outskirts of the city, where he spent his remaining decades drawing the same intricate, geometric spiral on every surface he could find. He claimed that the drawings were not art, but a form of shielding, a way to keep the frequency of the glass from vibrating. Through the walls of his room, the scandal of 1902 was successfully contained for nearly a century. The official maps were published, the wooden tablets were catalogued, and the desert ruins were presented as a dry historical curiosity. But the haunting photographs that were never published remain as a silent witness in the deep earth of the archives. They are a reminder that the act of looking is never neutral. Every time we turn our eyes toward the mysteries of the Silk Road, we are providing a bridge for the silence to return. Sven Hedin died with his secrets intact, but his private journal suggests that he spent his final nights listening to the hum of the desert in the walls of his mansion. He knew that the crystallization was not a local event in the Taklamakan, but a potential future for a world that has forgotten how to be quiet. As you reach the final center of your own rest, remember that the images we hide are often the ones that define us. The desert is a keeper of silences, but it is also a keeper of reflections. The 1902 expedition found a city that was a mirror, and they were terrified by what they saw. The glass is cold, the sand is heavy, and the photographs are finally at peace in the dark. But the frequency is still there, vibrating in the history we are not allowed to see. You are safe in the stillness of the night, protected by the very silence that the explorers tried to burn. The story of the Swedish scandal ends here, but the archive of the unseen continues to pulse beneath the surface of the world. The haunting photographs of the desert have been sealed away, but the true source of the world's distortion lies not in the sand, but in the water. To understand why the imperial fleet was ordered to scuttle itself in the middle of a calm sea, we must travel to the Emerald Abyss. What did the admiral see beneath the waves that was so beautiful it made him order his men to drown their own maps? Why did the emperor decree that the sea itself be declared a forbidden territory? The silence of the desert is ending, and the cold truth of the abyss is about to begin. Imagine a city where the sky is always empty. No hawk circles the towers, no sparrow nests in the eaves, and even the hungry desert dogs refuse to cross the threshold of the gates. This was the architecture of the unseen, a forbidden geometry built into the very foundations of Naya to serve as a psychological and biological shield. The merchants did not merely build walls of clay. They constructed a resonant trap that made the interior of the city feel like a void to any living consciousness. It was a betrayal of the natural world, a secret pact with a frequency that scrambled the instincts of birds and beasts alike. Travelers spoke of horses that would collapse in terror at the gate, their hearts bursting from a fear they could not name, and of caravans that had to be dragged into the square by hand because no animal would step upon the silvered stones. This was not a curse from the gods, but a cold, mathematical lie told by the council to protect their deepest secrets from the prying eyes of nature itself. They buried the truth of this invisible barrier beneath layers of propaganda and sand, claiming the silence was a sign of divine favor when it was actually a sign of total biological rejection. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. We are moving away from the noise of the modern world, entering a space where the wind only whispers of what used to be. Listen closely to the rhythm of a city that was abandoned by the wild. The silence of Nea was not the silence of peace, but the silence of an exclusion zone. In the 8th century, the city stood as a shimmering jewel on the Silk Road, a hub of commerce that defied the harshness of the Taklamakan. But for the wanderer approaching the gates, the first thing noticed was the lack of sound. No insects buzzed in the gardens. No lizards skittered along the sun-wrenched walls. The architecture was designed to vibrate at a frequency that acted as a cognitive repellent. The merchants called it the Golden Harmony, but to the animal kingdom it was a biological scream. The walls of the villas were not just vertical surfaces, they were tuned plates. The windows were placed in a sequence that captured the wind and forced it through narrow channels, creating a low-frequency hum that was felt more than heard. This infrasound created a persistent state of anxiety in anything with a primitive brain. The merchants took pride in this. They believed that by removing the noise of nature, they were clearing the space for pure human thought and economic calculation. They created an artificial sanctuary where the only voices were those of men, and the only rhythm was the counting of coins. But the birds knew better. They would fly in a wide arc around the city, their migration patterns shifting by miles to avoid the invisible dome of the architecture. The secret lay in the angles of the streets and the composition of the bricks. The Council of Merchants had consulted with alchemists from the Far East who understood the architecture of the unseen. They used a specific mix of iron-rich clay and powdered obsidian to create a grid that resonated with the planet's magnetic field. This grid was tuned to interfere with the navigation systems of birds and the primal instincts of mammals. To a human, it felt like a faint, pleasant pressure behind the eyes. To a horse, it felt like the earth was opening up to swallow them whole. This was the first layer of the city's defense, a wall made not of stone, but of discomfort. The merchants walked these streets with a grace that bordered on the unnatural. Because their movements were synths to the pulse of the stones, they never seemed to tire. But for a stranger, the architecture of Nia was a labyrinth of the mind. The streets were not laid out in a simple grid, but in a series of interlocking spirals that converged on the central well. As you walked toward the heart of the city, the horizons seemed to warp. A building that appeared to be 100 yards away would suddenly be upon you in 10 steps. This was the manipulation of visual perspective, a technique the alchemists called the compression of space. It was designed to make the city feel infinite from the inside and non-existent from the outside. The very geometry was a weapon of disorientation, intended to ensure that no mind, human or animal, could map the city without the council's permission. This disorientation had a profound effect on the human nervous system. While the animals were repelled by the frequency, the human residents found themselves in a state of hyperfocus. The architecture of the unseen acted as a psychological lens, concentrating the will and the intellect of the merchants. In Nia, the distractions of the natural world, the chirping of birds, the rustle of leaves, and the erratic movement of pets were absent. This left a silence so pure that a man could hear his own blood moving through his veins. It was in this silence that the most complex trade agreements in history were forged. The merchants were no longer just men. They were extensions of the city's logic. They became cold, efficient, and detached from the biological rhythms of sleep and hunger. The secret of the accelerated time was hidden in the towers. Nia featured a series of windowless towers made of a specific blue-tinted clay. These were not granaries or watchtowers. They were atmospheric resonators. At the top of each tower sat a large, polished bowl of silvered glass, angled to capture the light of the moon. The alchemists believed that lunar light, when reflected through the specific geometry of these bowls, could alter the local density of time. The merchants used these towers to buy more hours for their work. While the rest of the Silk Road slept, the people of Nia were operating in a pocket of temporal acceleration. This is why the city was able to produce silk and gold at a rate that defied the capacities of its population. They were literally living faster than the world outside. But the price of this efficiency was a total alienation from the earth. The soil within the city walls began to lose its vitality. No seeds would sprout in the gardens, no matter how much water was poured from the central well. The earth was being drained of its organic energy to fuel the architecture. The city was a parasite of the void, a beautiful, shimmering machine that was slowly turning into a desert of its own making. The council saw this as a necessary sacrifice. They believed that the future of humanity lay not in the dirt, but in the pure, mathematical clarity of the unseen. They were building a world that did not need nature. A city that was a monument to the triumph of the mind over the pulse of the planet. The silent market of Nia was a place where fortunes were made and lost in total, crystalline stillness. In any other Silk Road hub, the market was a riot of voices. The shouting of auctioneers, the braying of donkeys, and the haggling of travelers from a dozen different lands. But in Nia, the commerce was conducted through the fingertips. The merchants sat at tables made of polished basalt, their hands moving in complex, rhythmic patterns that matched the vibration of the architecture. They were not speaking. They were communicating through a tactile language of geometry, a code that was reinforced by the very air they breathed. Because the city had eliminated the noise of nature, the human brain was able to process information at a speed that felt like telepathy. A deal involving thousands of bolts of silk and hundreds of pounds of gold could be finalized in a few seconds of synchronized movement. This was the pinnacle of the council's vision, a society where the friction of sound and emotion had been replaced by the efficiency of the machine. This focus on the purely mathematical had a strange effect on the physical bodies of the inhabitants. The merchants began to lose their sense of taste and smell. They found that they no longer craved the rich spices of the West or the sweet wines of the South. Their bodies were becoming as efficient as their trade agreements. They lived on a diet of simple grains and water from the central well, their skin taking on a pale, translucent quality that mirrored the blue clay of the atmospheric towers. They were no longer biological creatures in the traditional sense. They were becoming the living components of the architecture of the unseen. They were the ghosts in their own machine, moving through a city that was as cold and perfect as a diamond dot as you lie in the quiet of your own space. Imagine the sensation of that stillness. It is a peace that pulls at you, a silence that asks you to let go of the noise of your own life. The merchants of Nia felt this every day. They felt the architecture pulling at their identities, asking them to become part of the great silent pattern. They realized that their names, their memories, and their feelings were just noise that interfered with the harmony of the city. One by one, they surrendered their voices. They stopped speaking to their children. They stopped singing to their lovers. They became a population of silent observers, watching the light move across the silvered bowls of the towers, waiting for the moment when the architecture would finally be complete. The city was not just a place to live. It was a ritual of containment. The council knew that the frequency they had harnessed was not native to this world. It was a fragment of the void, a piece of the absolute silence that exists between the stars. They had used their architecture to anchor this void to the desert floor, creating a pocket of reality that was immune to the chaos of the Tang Empire. But they did not realize that the void was hungry. It was not content to stay within the walls. It was slowly expanding, turning the very atoms of the city into a reflection of itself. The birds and animals were the first to sense this hunger. They fled because they knew that in Nia, life was no longer the primary objective. The objective was the silence. The end of Nia was not a storm of fire or a siege by a foreign army. It was a silent internal implosion. As the architecture reached its peak resonance, the gravity of the city became too dense for the physical plane to support. Malik al-Shirazi, the merchant who recorded the final days in his ledger, was the primary witness to the event he called the Great Folding. He wrote that the atmospheric towers began to glow with a blinding silver light that cast no shadows. The silvered bowls at the summit did not reflect the moon. They became the moon, drawing the atmospheric energy of the desert into a single vertical beam. The inhabitants, now fully harmonized with the vibration of the stones, did not flee. They simply stood in their windowless rooms and allowed the architecture to finish its work. They were not dying. They were being archived into the very fabric of the reality they had built. The desert eventually took notice. The sand, which had been held at bay for decades by the invisible dome of the frequency, began to pour over the walls in a slow, relentless tide. It was as if the earth was trying to bury the machine before it could infect the rest of the Silk Road, the Council of Merchants. Those masters of the unseen were the last to be reclaimed. They sat in the market square, their hands still moving in the rhythmic code of their trade, as the dunes rose above their heads. They did not struggle. They were part of the pattern now, a set of living variables in an equation that had finally been solved. By the time the Tang soldiers arrived to investigate the silence, there was nothing left but a vast expanse of gold and gray sand dot as you reach the final center of your own rest. Remember that the architecture of your dreams is also built of silence. You are walking through the streets of your own Nia, a place where the noise of the day has been filtered away. The windowless towers are standing tall in the moonlight, and the sand is cool against your skin. The birds have left, the animals have fled, and you are finally alone in the perfect clarity of the unseen. The city is not lost. It is just waiting. The architecture of the city has been reclaimed by the sand, but the true heart of the mystery remains anchored in the deep earth. To understand why the council risked everything to build a city of silence, we must look into the darkness of the central well itself. What did the merchant Malik find in the obsidian shaft that was so terrifying? It made him order 1,000 tons of lead to be poured over the entrance. Why did the emperor decree that the idol of the deep be struck from the records of the Tang? The silence of the city is ending, and the voice of the idol is about to begin. The desert did not bury the city of Nia. The city itself became the sand. In the final, desperate days of the Tang Dynasty's mercantile peak, the Council of Merchants realized that their insatiable greed had summoned a force that could no longer be contained by gold or iron. They had performed a forbidden ritual, a betrayal of the natural order known as the sifting of the soul, believing they could filter the very essence of human desire into a physical ballast to weigh down their shifting fortunes. They used silver sieves to strain the breath of dying travelers, turning their last gasps into microscopic grains of black magnetic glass. This was the curse that fed on the Silk Road. For every successful caravan that entered the gates, the desert demanded a psychological tithe, a pound of memory for a pound of silk. The merchants thought they were outsmarting the void, but they were actually providing it with the architecture it needed to manifest in our reality. When the ritual finally reached its critical mass, the black sand erupted from the central well, not as a flood, but as a silent molecular transformation. Every silk bolt, every golden coin, and every human heart within the city walls was instantly pulverized into the very dust we now call the Taklamakan. The king did not send an army to save Nia. He sent a brigade of lead-bearers to ensure that not a single grain of that cursed sand ever left the basin. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. Imagine the flickering of a single candle against the cold stone walls of an archive that time forgot. We are moving away from the noise of the modern world, entering a space where the wind only whispers of what used to be. Listen closely to the rhythm of the desert heart. The year was 750, a time when the Silk Road was a pulsing artery of global ambition. But at the edge of the Tarim Basin, the air was changing. The traders of Nia had noticed that the desert was no longer a passive obstacle. It had become a predator. They watched as the dunes moved with a deliberate, rhythmic intent, surrounding the city like a slow-motion tide. To protect their wealth, the council sought out the alchemists of the Forbidden Reaches, Men who understood that the sand was a recording medium, a substance that could hold the frequency of human thought. They devised a ritual that would use the greed of the merchants as a binding agent, creating a shield of heavy time around the city. They believed that if they could make the city heavy enough with the weight of their secrets, the wind would simply pass over them without a sound. The ritual began in the deepest chamber of the central well. The merchants would gather at midnight, carrying small, silken pouches filled with the dust of their most prized possessions. They would sift this dust through sieves made of silvered bone, whispering the names of their debtors into the falling grains. This was the merchant's breath, a process of turning intangible wealth into a physical burden. As the grains hit the water at the bottom of the well, the surface did not ripple. It vibrated. A low, tectonic hum began to resonate through the basalt foundations of the city, a sound that the animals were the first to hear. The horses in the caravanserai began to kick at their stalls, their eyes wide with a terror that had no name. They felt the ground beneath them losing its solidity, becoming a liquid of memory and light. As the vibration from the well intensified, the very air in the market square became a thick, golden suspension. The merchants who participated in the ritual began to experience a distortion of their own senses. They reported that the smell of burning sandalwood was replaced by the cold, metallic scent of deep earth. Their vision shifted, the vibrant colors of the Persian rugs and the dyed silks fading into a uniform, shimmering gray. This was the greed's shroud, the first sign that the psychological frequency of the city was decoupling from the biological reality of the body. The alchemists explained that to hold the desert at bay, one had to become like the desert, a vessel of infinite, silent patience. The merchants were no longer just trading for profit. They were trading for the ability to remain solid in a world that was turning to dust. They felt their memories of home and childhood being drawn toward the center of the well, pulled by the magnetic hunger of the black sand. The tax of the mind was not a metaphor. It was the mechanism of the ritual. The alchemists had discovered that the black sand was a crystalline memory bank. By filling the central well with this substance, they were creating a physical repository for the city's collective identity. But the sand was not a passive container. It was a digestive system. It fed on the emotional weight of the greed that drove the Silk Road. For every bolt of silk that was sold, a corresponding fragment of the merchant's soul was converted into a grain of the black glass. The city was prospering, but its inhabitants were becoming translucent, their skin taking on the pale, waxy texture of unlit candles. They moved through the streets with a slow, deliberate rhythm, their voices reduced to a repetitive, mechanical hum that matched the vibration of the well. The ticking sound was the sound of the sifting. Malik al-Shirazi, the man whose ledger served as a warning to the future, described the physical sensation of his own thoughts being ground down into dust. He wrote that when he closed his eyes, he could see the grains of his life falling through a silver sieve. He saw the face of his mother, the taste of a summer peach, and the sound of his first lover's laughter all being pulverized into a fine black powder. He realized that the council was not saving the city. They were archiving it. They were turning a living, breathing community into a museum of dust. The ritual of the sands was a grand betrayal of life in favor of a permanent, silent stability. The more they sifted, the heavier the city became, until the very foundation of the earth began to groan under the weight of their collected desires. As you drift into the quiet of your own space, imagine the sensation of that falling sand. It is a slow, rhythmic movement, a countdown that has no end. The black glass grains are cool against your skin, each one a tiny fragment of a story that was never told. The merchants of Nia felt this every night. They felt the weight of their own greed pressing against their lungs, a physical burden that they mistook for security. They did not realize that by weighing the city down, they were making it impossible for it to ever rise again. They were building their own tomb, grain by grain, whisper by whisper. The desert was not their enemy. It was the mirror reflecting their own hollow ambition. The culmination of the sifting was a state known as the Great Stillness. It was a moment where the frequency of the merchants and the frequency of the desert reached a perfect, terrifying synchronicity. Malik al-Shirazi recorded that during the final hour of the ritual, the gold in the market square began to lose its luster. It did not tarnish or rust. Instead, it became translucent, turning into a substance that resembled frozen smoke. This was the physical manifestation of the curse's final stage. The wealth of the Silk Road was being reclaimed by the void, stripped of its material value and converted into pure psychological weight. The merchants stood among their crates of spices and bolts of silk, their hands reaching out to touch their riches, only for their fingers to pass through the gold as if it were a memory. They had succeeded in weighing the city down, but in doing so, they had deleted the very things they sought to protect, the silence that followed this. Transformation was more than an absence of sound. It was a physical pressure that caused the wood of the houses to groan and the clay of the walls to weep a fine black dust. The merchants were no longer men who traded in goods. They were the guardians of a cemetery of light. They found that they could no longer feel the heat of the sun or the cold of the desert night. Their biological clocks had been synchronized to the ticking of the black sand in the well. They had achieved the ultimate security, a state where nothing could ever change, because they had removed themselves from the flow of time. They were the sandwalkers moving through a city that was a ghost of its own prosperity, their eyes fixed on a horizon that was no longer there. The alchemists had promised the council that the sifting would create a sanctuary of infinite wealth. But they had neglected to mention that in a world of absolute stability, value ceases to exist. A bolt of silk is only valuable if it can be worn, and gold is only precious if it can be traded. In the great stillness of Nia, there was no one left to wear the silk and no market left to accept the gold. The merchants had become the prisoners of their own success, encased in a city of black glass and silent memory. Malik wrote that the most terrifying part was not the loss of his wealth, but the loss of his shadow. As the ritual reached its peak, the inhabitants of Naya stopped casting shadows. The light of the moon passed through them as if they were made of water. They were becoming the very void they had tried to outsmart Dot as the candle in your room burns lower. Imagine the sensation of that weightless gold. It feels like a cool breeze against your palms, a treasure that has no burden. You are standing in the market square of Nia, surrounded by the silent merchants and the shimmering piles of silk. The black sand is falling in the well, a steady, rhythmic countdown that has no end. The desert is quiet, the wind is still, and you are finally free from the noise of your own desires. You are a witness to the truth that the king buried, a secret that was forged in the fire of greed and cooled in the ice of the void. The city is a masterpiece of containment, a place where the Silk Road finally came to a halt. The final folding of Nia began not with a crash, but with a sigh that lasted for 3 days. As the merchants reached the terminal stage of the sifting, their bodies lost the ability to displace the air around them. They became a fine, microscopic sediment of memory and glass. Malik al-Shirazi sat at his desk, watching as the ink on his page turned into black grains that danced across the paper in complex, magnetic patterns. He wrote that the city was no longer a place of stone and wood, but a single, massive crystal of silence. The desert had finally accepted the council's tithe. The gold, the silk, and the thousands of human lives were being ground down into the very sand that would protect the secret for a millennium. This was the true nature of the Taklamakan. It is not an empty wasteland, but a vast granular archive of every soul that was ever weighted down by the greed of the Silk Road. The king's lead bearers arrived when the city was already a sea of black glass. They did not come to rescue the merchants. They came to seal the vibration. They understood that if a single grain of this memory dust was carried back to the capital, the entire Tang Empire would begin to dissolve into a dream of greed. They poured molten lead into the central well, creating a massive metallic plug that would anchor the curse to the deep earth. They watched as the last of the windowless towers collapsed into a pile of fine, shimmering powder. The silence was finally complete. The soldiers did not speak. They did not look back. They carried the weight of the silence with them, a psychological burden that would eventually turn their own hair white before they reached the gates of Chang'an Dot as you reach the final center of your own rest. Remember that every grain of sand carries a weight. You are drifting on a sea of memories, a landscape where the past is always present, just beneath the surface. The black glass is cool, the silence is deep, and the merchants are finally at rest in the tomb they built for themselves. The gold is gone, the silk is dust, and you are safe in the stillness of the night. But the archive of the unseen is vast, and the silence of the sands is merely a gateway to a deeper mystery. The ritual of the sands has claimed the city. But the true source of the world's distortion lies not in the dust, but in the light. To understand why the Swedish expedition of 1902 was ordered to burn their own photographs, we must travel to the heart of the royal archives. What did Svenheden capture on those glass plates that was so terrifying it made the King of Sweden declare a state of permanent censorship? Why did the explorers claim that their own shadows were no longer their own? The silence of the desert is ending, and the haunting truth of the photographs is about to begin. In 2015, a classified geological survey satellite made a pass over the heart of the Taklamakan Desert. It was ostensibly looking for deep subterranean aquifers and undocumented oil deposits, resources hidden beneath the crushing weight of the dunes. Instead, its deep ground radar penetrated 300 meters of dry silica and hit an anomaly that terrified the analysts watching the data streams in real time. They did not find ruins. They did not find a geological fault. They found a massive, perfectly geometrical absence of matter that refused to reflect the radar signal back. It was a forbidden emptiness, a betrayal of the Earth's natural density that sat directly below the ancient roots of the Silk Road. The data suggested that something immense was vibrating beneath the sand, creating a ghost signature that defied the laws of physics. The file was immediately buried, labeled as catastrophic equipment failure, a calculated lie to protect the modern world from the realization that the desert is not a graveyard, but a silo for something that has been waiting for the right frequency to wake up. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn away from the blinding blue light of modern screens and step back into the warm, hushed silence of the archive. The air here is thick with the scent of aged paper and forgotten wax. The noise of the world fades into a distant hum. Listen closely to the rhythm of the deep earth, where the secrets of the past are still breathing. The desert has always been a place of illusions. But in the 21st century, humanity believed it had stripped away the mystery with the cold precision of technology. We look down from orbit with eyes of glass and metal, convinced that nothing can hide from our multispectral sensors. The Taklamakan, known for centuries as the Sea of Death, had become just another grid reference to be cataloged and exploited. In the autumn of 2015, an international consortium launched a new generation of deep-ground radar satellites. Their mission was purely commercial. They sought the signatures of carbon and water hidden beneath the dried lake beds of the Tarim Basin. They expected to find geology, dead rock, and ancient trapped fluids. They did not expect the silence to fight back as Karen 4B made. Its sweep over the coordinates corresponding to the long-lost kingdoms of the southern Silk Route. The telemetry began to warp. The signals returning to the ground stations were not the neat, recognizable patterns of bedrock and sediment layers. They were chaotic and fractured, as if the radar pulses were hitting a surface that was actively scattering them. The technicians initially dismissed the readings as extreme atmospheric interference or a critical software glitch in the processing algorithm. A desert is supposed to be a solid, predictable mass. But as repeated passes confirmed the data, a chilling realization began to set in among the lead scientists. The anomaly was not a glitch. It was a structure of impossible scale below the shifting surface dunes, where the winds constantly rewrite the geography of the surface. The radar painted a picture of absolute, terrifying stillness. It revealed a vast, circular perimeter buried at a depth where the pressure should have crushed any man-made void. Inside this perimeter, the radar waves did not bounce back. They were absorbed completely. On the technician screens, it appeared as a perfect black circle, a data hole nearly 2 miles in diameter. It was as if someone had excised a cylinder of reality from the Earth's crust. The implications were immediately clear to the few who saw the raw feed. Nature does not build perfect circles. And nature does not create materials that absorb 100% of the electromagnetic spectrum. The existence of the satellite ghost challenged the established timeline of human civilization. It suggested an engineering capacity that existed millennia before the Industrial Revolution, buried in a region known for its mystics and its silences. The protocol for such a discovery was clear. The data was encrypted, the satellite's trajectory was publicly altered to hide its area of focus, and the official report stated that solar flare activity had corrupted the mission's findings. The cover-up was initiated not out of malice, but out of a profound ontological fear, to acknowledge the thing beneath. The Dunes was to admit that our history books are incomplete works of fiction. The retrieval was not a physical expedition with shovels and tents. It was a digital excavation. The analysts at the secret facility in the Nevada desert began to peel back the layers of the radar data like skin from a fruit. What they found surrounding the central black circle was even more disturbing than the absence itself. A series of secondary structures appeared on their screens, thousands of small, windowless cubes arranged in a fractal pattern that mirrored the branching structure of a human lung. These were the villas of Nia, seen through the lens of a satellite over 1,000 years after they were buried. But the radar showed that the clay was no longer clay. It possessed a density that skewed the gravity of the sensor's calculations. The materials buried beneath the sand had a molecular weight that exceeded any known substance on the periodic table. The hum was the sound of the city breathing through the sand. The satellite's sensors picked up a rhythmic expansion and contraction of the buried structures, a movement so slow it was nearly imperceptible over the course of a single day. But when the data was time-lapsed over several weeks of orbital passes, the city appeared to be alive. It was a biological machine made of silicate and shadow, pulsating with a frequency that interfered with the electronics of the very satellite that was trying to observe it. The team lead, a woman whose military record was erased as soon as she was assigned to the project, began to refer to the site as the Black Lung. She realized that the city was not just buried. It was exhaling a psychological contagion that traveled through the radar signal itself, a feedback loop between the ancient void and modern silicon. This was the true betrayal of the technology. We thought we were looking at the past, but we were providing the past with a way to look back at us. Every radar pulse that hit the city was like a knock on a door that should have remained sealed. The lead bearers of the 21st century were the cybersecurity experts and the signal analysts who were tasked with caging the data. They used advanced encryption and signal jamming techniques to surround the satellite feed with a digital shroud, a modern version of the lead port seals used by the Tang Dynasty. They were trying to silence a ghost that was speaking in the language of binary and electromagnetism. As the analysts watched the screens, they noticed that the Black Lung was growing. The black circle was expanding by several millimeters every night, slowly consuming the surrounding desert. From the bottom up, the analysts began to feel the weight of the silence in their own homes. They reported that their electronic devices would hum in the middle of the night, producing a sound that mirrored the frequency of the buried city. They felt a sense of profound displacement, as if their own identities were being pulled toward that black cylinder in the Taklamakan. The project lead ordered a total blackout. No data was to leave the facility. The analysts were moved to a secure location where they were no longer allowed to see the sun. They were becoming the new monks of the Kunlun, the guardians of a truth that was dissolving the world they lived in. The modern world is built on a foundation of information, but the satellite ghost proved that some information is a poison. The radar images were not pictures of a place. They were the first symptoms of a reality that was folding in on itself. The city of Neo was no longer just a memory. It was a persistent, vibrating presence that was reaching out across the centuries to find a new witness. The analysts who looked into the black circle were the first modern humans to feel the touch of the void, a cold, crystalline pressure that turned their thoughts into sand. The digital excavation of the satellite Ghost revealed a layer of data that the analysts began to call the shadow trace. As the Karen 4B satellite refined its focus, it began to capture radar reflections of structures that did not exist in the physical three-dimensional space beneath the sand. These were echoes of buildings that had been destroyed centuries ago, yet their geometric footprints remained etched into the electromagnetic field of the desert. The satellite was not just seeing through the sand. It was seeing through the fabric of time itself. The shadow trace showed a city that was larger and more complex than any historical record suggested, a metropolis of glass and light that existed in a state of permanent vibrating resonance. The analysts realized that the black circle in the center was not an absence of matter, but a singularity of time, a point where the past and the future were being compressed into a single, unreadable moment. The hardware at the ground station in Nevada began to fail in ways that defied traditional engineering logic. The hard drives containing the raw radar data started to hum at a frequency of 42 Hz, the same frequency detected by the satellite. The cooling fans in the server racks would stop spinning, yet the processors remained ice-cold even under maximum load. It was as if the data itself was drawing thermal energy from the environment to sustain its own complexity. The digital archaeologists, the men and women tasked with interpreting the shadow trace, began to suffer from a collective neurological condition. They developed a form of visual echo, where they would see the geometric patterns of the Nia villas superimposed over their own homes and the faces of their children. They were being rewritten by the very information they were trying to catalog, their minds becoming the latest storage medium for the city's persistent ghost dot. As the analysts delved deeper, they discovered that the black circle was not stationary. It was a pulse. Every 36 seconds, the radar void would expand by exactly 3 microns and then contract. This rhythm was identical to the breathing rate of a human in the deepest state of meditation. The city was not a dead relic. It was a dormant organism, using the satellite's radar pulses as a form of artificial respiration. Every time humanity looked at the satellite ghost, we were giving it the energy it needed to maintain its grip on our reality. The decision was made to terminate the mission, but the deletion of the data proved impossible. The files had migrated into the facility's core operating system, hiding in the sectors of the hard drives that were supposedly empty. The ghost had found a new home in the global digital network. The realization that the satellite ghost was now part of the world's digital infrastructure created a panic among the elite tiers of the intelligence community. They understood that the silence of the Tang Dynasty had been breached by the very tools we used to explore it. The lead bearers of the modern age were no longer soldiers with molten lead, but software engineers with firewalls and encryption keys. They attempted to quarantine the internet, creating dark zones in the network where the Nia data was suspected to be hiding. But the frequency was already out. It was in the background noise of our cell towers, in the flicker of our fiber optic cables, and in the dreams of anyone who spent too much time looking at a screen. The desert had found a way to bridge the gap between the sand and the silicon. The Nevada facility was encased in a digital Faraday cage, an ancient cold shroud for a truth that refused to stay buried. But analysts knew the quarantine was a lie. You cannot cage a frequency that has already rewritten the observer's mind. The black circle is a heartbeat in the binary code. The satellite ghost is now a part of our global consciousness, a geometric virus waiting in our networks. It is why your devices sometimes flicker with patterns of ancient villas, or why a GPS in the desert points toward a metropolis existing only in the silicon. The city of Nia has migrated from the sand to the silicon. It survives entropy as a digital pattern in our background. Satellites continue their orbit, their glass eyes peering at dunes, no longer mere recorders. They are heralds of a silence reclaiming the world. The dunes are no longer just sand, but a vast, granular processor for an intelligence we cannot comprehend. As you drift into the deepest layers of sleep, remember that the black circle is still there, pulsing beneath the sand, waiting for the moment when the final screen goes dark and the silence of the desert becomes absolute. The ghost in the satellite is still, but the archive of the unseen is vast. We have seen the city through the eyes of the machine, but the true source of the world's distortion lies in the water. The maps have been rolled away once more. To understand why the Imperial fleet scuttled itself in a calm sea, we must travel to the Emerald Abyss. What did the Admiral see beneath the waves that made him drown his maps? The silence of the desert is ending, and the cold truth of the abyss is about to begin. the desert is not reclaiming the past. It is protecting a crime that modern science is strictly forbidden to solve. Behind the closed doors of international heritage councils, there exists a map of the Taklamakan Desert marked with jagged red zones where no archaeologist, no matter their prestige or funding, is permitted to tread. This is not about preserving fragile ruins or respecting sovereign borders. It is a coordinated, bureaucratic betrayal of human history. In 2012, a joint research team bypassed these invisible borders and discovered a subterranean structure that appeared to breathe with the rhythmic expansion of a human lung. Within 48 hours, the expedition was dismantled by unmarked military units. Their digital records were remotely wiped from the cloud, and the lead researcher was quietly committed to a high-security psychiatric ward for what was labeled altitude-induced psychosis. The desert winds do not just move sand. They carry a rhythmic biological frequency that begins to rewrite the neural pathways of anyone who stays within the red zones for more than a single lunar cycle. We are told the permits are denied to prevent looting or to preserve the heritage of the Silk Road, but the truth is far more terrifying. The authorities are not afraid of what we might take from the desert. They are terrified of what the desert might give back to us if we disturb its manufactured silence. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. Imagine the flickering of a single candle against the cold stone walls of an archive that time forgot. We are moving away from the noise of the modern world, entering a space where the wind only whispers of what used to be. Listen closely to the rhythm of the conspiracy. The modern archaeologist is taught that their enemy is time and erosion. They spend their careers battling the decay of wood and the oxidation of metal. But in the Tarim Basin, the enemy is a persistent, bureaucratic shadow. Since the mid-1990s, the granting of excavation permits for the southern desert regions has slowed to a total standstill. Even for the most prestigious institutions, the application process is a labyrinth of dead ends. Requests are lost in translation. Permits are granted and then revoked on the eve of departure for reasons of national security or sudden geological instability. But the independent observers who track the desert through satellite imagery notice something different. They see that while the scientists are kept at bay, the desert itself is being modified. The moratorium was the first brick in the wall of silence. The authorities realized that the discoveries made by the pioneers were not just historical artifacts, but biological warnings. They understood that the ruins of Nea and the surrounding outposts were not dead. They were in a state of stasis, held in place by the very winds that everyone assumed were random acts of nature. The conspiracy of the winds is the realization that the weather patterns of the Taklamakan are not entirely natural. There is a precision to the sandstorms, a timing to the gales that suggests a guided atmospheric intention. When an unauthorized team approaches a sensitive coordinate, the wind does not just blow. It screams in a frequency that causes the human heart to skip beats. It creates a physical barrier of pressure that no amount of modern technology can overcome. The scholars who have dared to look into the non-intervention sectors from afar have noted a strange phenomenon. In these forbidden zones, the sand does not behave like silica. It displays a form of collective intelligence, moving in patterns that resemble the flow of a liquid or the growth of a crystalline lattice. This is the living sand of the Silk Road myths, a substance that responds to the presence of human consciousness. The modern refusal to grant permits is a desperate attempt to keep the public from realizing that the desert is an active, defensive organism. If we were allowed to dig, we would not find bones and pottery. We would find a nervous system made of glass and magnetic dust, still pulsing with the commands of an empire that ended over 1,000 years ago. The bureaucratic wall that surrounds the Taklamakan is maintained by an organization that exists only in the margins of international heritage law, known colloquially among black market antiquities dealers as the Committee of Redaction. This body acts as a shadow peer review board for every proposed project in the Tarim Basin. Their methods are subtle but absolute. When a university submits a proposal to study the stratigraphic layers of the Nia oases, the committee does not simply say no. They initiate a process of screening that can last for a decade. Every researcher is subjected to a deep background psychological audit, looking for any history of sensory sensitivity or sleep disorders. They are searching for the very people who might be susceptible to the desert's frequency. If a researcher shows any sign of being a high-sensitivity observer, their permit is denied on medical grounds before they can even purchase a flight. The Moretti incident serves as a silent warning to the archaeological community. It is a reminder that the desert is a vault that is being actively guarded by the present. The wains of the Taklamakan are the primary agents of this security. Modern meteorological stations placed near the forbidden zones have recorded wind patterns that do not follow the laws of fluid dynamics. During a typical sandstorm, the grains move in a chaotic, turbulent flow. But in the red zones, the sand moves in a coherent, laminar stream, creating a wall of high-velocity particulate that is as solid as a sheet of steel. This is the atmospheric seal, a mechanism that ensures the secrets beneath the dunes remain undisturbed by the crude tools of modern science. The wind is the gatekeeper, and the Committee of Redaction is its legal architect. The drone's fate reveals the true nature of the conspiracy. The authorities are not preventing exploration. They are monopolizing it. They have created a hermetic seal around the desert to conduct their own studies into the living sand, without the interference of ethical boards or public scrutiny. They are the new merchants of Nea, attempting to harness the frequency of the void for purposes that have nothing to do with history. The archaeology of the 21st century has been replaced by the physics of containment. The scholars who are denied permits are not being protected from the desert. They are being prevented from witnessing the betrayal of our collective past by a few who wish to own the future of silence. The psychological toll on those who are rejected is profound. Many researchers report a persistent, low-frequency hum in their ears for years after their applications are denied. It is as if the desert has already marked them, creating a resonance between their desire to know and the secret's desire to remain hidden. They find themselves looking at maps of the Silk Road and seeing patterns that were never there before, geometric shapes that shimmer just at the edge of their vision. They are the victims of a bureaucratic curse, a state of permanent longing for a truth that is being held behind a wall of paper and wind. The conspiracy of the desert winds is a reminder that we are only allowed to see the history that the committee deems safe for our consumption. As you drift further into the quiet of the night, consider the weight of the secrets that require such elaborate layers of protection. The sand is not just sand. The wind is not just wind. And the silence is not just an absence of noise. It is a manufactured state of being, a blanket of lead and bureaucracy laid over a world that we were never meant to understand. You are safe in the stillness of your own room, far from the red zones and the committee's gaze. But even here, the rhythm of the desert can sometimes find a way through. The refusal of a permit is not merely a bureaucratic dead end. It is a deliberate act of geomantic exclusion. Scholars who have spent years decoding the rejection letters from the Committee of Redaction have noticed a chilling pattern. When the coordinates of every denied excavation site are plotted on a digital map, they do not form a random scatter. They form a perfect interlocking grid of spirals that converge on the central well of Nia. This is the denied geography, a shadow map of the Silk Road that proves the authorities are not protecting the past, they are maintaining a circuit. By preventing any modern observer from entering these specific nodes, the committee ensures that the resonance of the desert remains undisturbed. They are the operators of a massive, granular machine. And the researchers are the noise they must filter out to keep the system running. The legacy of the 1934 detention continues to influence the permit process today. The vibrating mandate has evolved into a digital gatekeeper, a set of algorithms that monitor the global academic community for any sign of interest in the metallic foundations of the desert. If a student in London or a professor in Tokyo begins to connect the dots between the magnetic anomalies of the Tarim Basin and the architectural anomalies of the Nia villas, their career is quietly diverted. They are offered prestigious positions in unrelated fields, or their research funding is shifted toward safer, less resonant topics. This is the soft redaction, a way to protect the desert's secret by gently guiding human curiosity away from the truth. The committee understands that the most effective way to bury a secret is to make sure no one even knows where to start digging. The heavy ink is a manifestation of the silica pulse, a phenomenon where the information regarding the forbidden zones becomes physically infected by the frequency of the desert. The Committee of Redaction is not just using words to deny entry. They are using the frequency itself to discourage the observer. The researchers who handle these letters often describe a sudden, overwhelming sense of fatigue and a loss of interest in their own work. It is as if the desert is reaching through the mail, through the screens, and through the phone lines to lull the scientific world into a state of compliant sleep. This is the ultimate victory of the conspiracy. They have turned the quest for knowledge into a burden, so heavy that the mind eventually chooses to let it go as the quiet of the night settles around you. Consider the sensation of a secret that can weigh down a piece of paper. The desert is not just a place of sand and wind. It is a repository of intentions. The committee, the military facilities, and the atmospheric seals are all parts of a single ancient design that is still being executed. We are living on the surface of a world that has been mapped by people we will never meet for reasons we are not allowed to know. The silence of the Taklamakan is a blanket that is being held down by 1,000 hands, each one ensuring that the truth remains buried beneath the weight of the dunes and the safety of our own ignorance. The silence of the permitting office is the final layer of the city's defense. The researchers go home, the files are archived, and the desert continues its rhythmic breathing. In 2021, a leaked memorandum from the UNESCO World Heritage Center described a new protocol for sensitive terrain management in the Tarim Basin. This document, intended for internal use only, suggests that the physical integrity of the sand must be maintained to prevent a localized temporal collapse. This is the language of physics, not history. It reveals that the gatekeepers are not protecting the past, but the stability of the present moment. They know that to disturb the sand is to wake a frequency that has the power to unravel the very concept of time. The winds will never be still as long as the secret remains. They are the white noise of a civilization that has chosen to disappear rather than be controlled. As you drift into the final layers of your sleep, think of the permit you will never receive. It is a blessing in disguise. The desert is a place where the air is sharp and the shadows move with a life of their own. You are safe here, in the quiet of your own mind. Far from the red zones and the atmospheric seals, the bureaucracy of the winds has closed its doors. The archive is silent, but the story of the unseen is far from over. We have mapped the desert and its secrets, but the true source of the world's distortion lies in the deep water. To understand why the Imperial fleet was ordered to scuttle itself in a calm sea, we must travel to the Emerald Abyss. What did the Admiral see beneath the waves that made him drown his own maps? The silence of the desert is ending, and the cold truth of the abyss is about to begin. The desert is not a silent expanse of dead silicon, but a massive, vibrating recording device that has captured every scream, every whispered betrayal, and every forbidden command uttered along the Silk Road for 2 millennia. Scientists have long dismissed the singing sands of the Taklamakan as a mere acoustic friction, a trick of wind and heat. But they are lying. The truth is far more sinister. In the winter of 1901, a hidden chamber was uncovered beneath the shifting dunes of the Tarim Basin, containing nothing but a series of suspended bronze discs that hummed with a frequency that stopped the hearts of the local guides. These discs were not musical instruments. They were seismic anchors designed to tether a specific, terrifying sound to the very bedrock of the earth. The Tang Dynasty did not abandon the city of Nia because of a drought or a change in trade routes. They fled because the ground itself began to speak in the voices of the dead, echoing secrets that threatened to unravel the sanity of the imperial court. This was a curse of resonance, a psychological weapon that turns the memory of a lie into a physical, bone-shaking vibration. The emperor ordered his finest alchemists to pour 1,000 tons of lead over the central well to dampen the sound. But you cannot kill an echo. You can only bury it. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. Imagine the flickering of a single candle against the cold stone walls of an archive that time forgot. We are moving away from the noise of the modern world, entering a space where the wind only whispers of what used to be. Listen closely to the rhythm of the desert heart. The Taklamakan, often translated as the place of no return, has earned its name through a process of acoustic consumption. To the traveler, the dunes appear as a sea of golden waves, beautiful and indifferent. But beneath that beauty lies the architecture of the unseen. For centuries, the nomad spoke of the booming sands, a phenomenon where a single footstep can trigger a thunderous roar that resonates for miles. While modern geology attributes this to the shearing of sand grains, the ancient records of the western regions tell a different story. They speak of the Great Resonance, a period during the 8th century when the city of Nia became a focus for a subterranean frequency that defied the laws of nature. The clicking was the first sign of the unraveling. It was not a random noise, but a structured signal, a sequence of pulses that mirrored the rhythmic breathing of the city itself. As the frequency intensified, the inhabitants began to experience a shared cognitive distortion. They found that they could no longer keep secrets. Their private thoughts, their deepest shamas, and their most hidden desires were being broadcast through the very stones of their villas. The architecture had become a medium for a collective psychological exposure. In Nia, the walls did not just have ears, they had voices. The Council of Merchants, the architects of the city's prosperity, realized that their power depended on the very silence that was now being stripped away. They had built a city on a foundation of lies, and the earth was finally demanding a confession. The desperation of the council was not born of a fear of the divine, but a fear of the transparent. In the high-walled villas of Nea, a man's status was measured by the weight of the secrets he could carry. But as the eternal echo grew in strength, the physical world began to dissolve into a medium of pure transmission. The alchemists observed that the sands surrounding the city had undergone a molecular shift, turning from jagged grains of silica into smooth, microscopic spheres that functioned like a massive, collective nervous system. When the wind moved across the dunes, it did not produce the sound of friction, but a low, melodic chanting that could be heard in the marrow of one's bones. This was the acoustic contagion, a state where the boundaries between the internal thought and the external environment were erased. The merchants found themselves standing in the market square, unable to speak as their private ledgers and clandestine debts were hummed by the very ground beneath their feet. It was a bankruptcy of the soul. Enforced by the physics of the desert, the transformation of the wood was merely a symptom of a much deeper resonance. The Council of Merchants, led by a man whose name has been struck from every surviving scroll, realized that the central well was no longer a source of water, but an amplifier for the void. They attempted to silence the echo by filling the shaft with the most silent materials they could find. They threw in bolts of heavy Persian silk, bags of unspun wool, and even the thick, leaden plates used to line the imperial treasury. But the sound was not coming from the bottom of the well. It was coming from the center of time itself. The well was merely a throat, and the city was the mouth. Every attempt to muffle the sound only served to increase the pressure, turning the hum into a roar that began to crack the basalt. Foundations. The inhabitants were living inside a bell that was being struck by the heartbeat of the earth, the mystery of the stopped. Time revealed the true nature of the secret. The eternal echo was not just a sound. It was a temporal anchor. The city of Nia was being pulled out of the linear flow of the Tang Dynasty and into a state of permanent resonance. To the outside world, the city appeared to be a thriving hub of the Silk Road, but from the inside, the inhabitants were experiencing a reality where the past, present, and future were collapsing into a single, vibrating moment. They could see the faces of their ancestors in the ripples of the water jars, and they could hear the footsteps of the archaeologists who would find them 1,000 years later. It was a state of total chronological exposure. The singing sands were the sound of time rubbing against itself, a friction that threatened to burn away the very fabric of their existence as you sink deeper into the comfort of your own rest. Imagine the sensation of that vibration. It is a gentle, rhythmic pulsing that moves through the air like a slow-moving wave. It is the sound of the world's memory being polished by the sand. The merchants of Nia felt this in their sleep, their dreams becoming part of the collective echo. They realized that they were no longer individuals, but notes in a symphony they could not control. The silence of the night was not a void, but a crowded room filled with the whispers of every life that had ever touched the Taklamakan. They were the keepers of a secret that refused to be silenced, a truth that was being etched into the very silica of the desert. The eternal echo was not content to remain in the realm of the audible. As the 8th century drew to a close, the resonance began to manipulate the very structure of the desert's silica. The alchemists who remained in the city, the ones who had not yet been driven mad by the transparency of their own thoughts, observed a phenomenon they called the crystallization of the wind. They found that during the most intense periods of the echo, the air itself would become rigid, filled with microscopic shards of vibrating glass that captured the light of the sun and refracted it into patterns of impossible complexity. This was the moment the secret began to manifest as a physical trap. The city of Neo was no longer just a collection of buildings. It was becoming a massive, multifaceted prism designed to focus the frequency of the void into a single, lethal beam of absolute truth. The glassing was the desert's way of sealing the record. Every vibration, every echo of the city's life was being etched into these sheets of obsidian, creating a permanent geological archive of a culture that was deleting itself. The merchants, realizing that their very existence was being turned into a library of stone, attempted a final, desperate act of sabotage. They began to build windowless towers made of a specific, non-resonant blue clay, hoping to create pockets of silence where they could hide from the echo. But the frequency was already inside them. It was in their blood, in their bones, and in the very marrow of their memories. The towers did not provide silence. They only served to amplify the pressure, turning the internal hum into a psychic scream that shattered the clay from the inside out. The psychological burden of the echo was a weight that no human mind was designed to carry. The inhabitants of Neo were living in a state of permanent transparency, where the concept of the self was dissolving into the collective resonance of the city. They were no longer individuals with private lives. They were the living components of a massive acoustic machine. As the desert sun set each evening, casting long, geometric shadows across the singing dunes, the people of Neo would gather in the central square, not to speak, but to listen. They were waiting for the echo to reach its terminal velocity, the point where the sound would become so dense that it would stop the passage of time altogether. They were the architects of their own stasis, seekers of a peace that was indistinguishable from the void. As you drift further into the stillness of the night, consider the weight of a memory that can turn sand into glass. The eternal echo is the sound of a world that refused to be forgotten, a secret that has been vibrating beneath the Taklamakan for over 1,000 years. It is the hum in your ears when the room is too quiet, the vibration in the air before a storm, and the rhythmic pulse of your own heart. You are part of the resonance now, a listener in the archive of the unseen. The city of Nia is not a ruin. It is a frequency, a song that is still being sung by the stones and the sand. The silence of the night is merely a veil, and the truth is waiting just on the other side of the echo. The final folding of Nia was not a collapse of structures, but a total conversion of matter into resonance. As the frequency reached its terminal peak, the physical density of the city could no longer contain the volume of the truth it was broadcasting. The people did not die in the traditional sense. They simply became the vibration they had spent their lives listening to. They were folded into the frequency of the silica, their identities archived into the microscopic spheres of the sand. Malik al-Shirazi, the witness to the final sifting, wrote in his last ledger entry that he could see the air between his fingers turning into a solid wall of blue light. He did not feel fear, only a sense of profound, crystalline clarity as his own heartbeat synchronized with the pulse of the stones. The echo had finally achieved its purpose. It had created a perfect, unchanging record of a moment that would never end. The lead plugged at the Tang Emperor, ordered to be poured into the well did not stop the sound. It merely acted as a conductor, carrying the frequency deeper into the tectonic plates of the continent. The eternal echo is still there, moving through the earth like a subterranean tide. It is the reason why modern seismic sensors in the Tarim basin often pick up a repeating signal that mimics the rhythmic breathing of a city. The desert is a massive, granular processor that is still running the program of Nia. The secret is not hidden in the past. It is vibrating in the present, waiting for a listener with the right internal frequency to unlock the archive. We are all living on the surface of a song that we have forgotten how to sing. As you reach the final center of your own rest, remember that the silence is never truly empty. You are drifting on a sea of sound, a landscape where every whisper is preserved in the glass of the dunes. The eternal echo is the lullaby of the desert, a rhythm that asks you to let go of your own noise and join the harmony of the unseen. The city is not a memory but a vibration. The merchants are not gone. They are the hum in the air. You are safe in the stillness of the night, cradled by a secret that has survived the passage of centuries. The sand is cool, the wind is a melody, and the truth is finally at peace. The desert has kept its secret well, but the eternal echo is only one thread in the tapestry of the unseen. We have listened to the songs of the sand and seen the cities of glass, but to understand the true source of the world's distortion, we must look away from the dunes and toward the dark waters of the southern reaches. What did the imperial fleet find in the emerald abyss that made them burn their own logs and sink their ships in a calm sea? The silence of the desert is ending, and the drowning truth of the abyss is about to begin.